Number 10. Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Born to the Minamoto clan, just as the Heian period was falling apart, Yoshitsune escaped the murder of his father and brothers during the Heiji Rebellion. He'd be placed in the care of monks at Kurama Temple, where he'd learn to use a sword and, more importantly, his mind. Leaving the temple, the stories of Yoshitsune drift between fact and fiction, some works of art depicting him defeating a bandit by the name of Kumasaka at the age of 15. What is held as truth is his friendship with Benkei, a warrior monk who was defeated by Yoshitsune in a friendly duel. The two would then join the Genpei War, Yoshitsune joining his brother Yoritomo, who had become head of the clan. After the war, his brother would become jealous of him, causing Yoshitsune to flee Kyoto until he was cornered and forced to fight Benkei. Supposedly, he was pressured into committing seppuku, though there is some debate on this, as the Ainu, the Japanese long-maligned indigenous peoples, hold a historical account of Yoshitsune escaping to Hokkaido. Number 9. Kunisoki Masahige. Active in the Kamakura period, Kunisoki was known for his contributions to the Kenmu Restoration in 1333. While his origins are generally unclear, it's agreed upon that he was a member of the gentry before his rise to fame. His career was spent mostly in the service of Emperor Go-Daigo in a war to overthrow the Kamakura shogunate, with the end goal of returning power to the rule of the emperor. Despite Kunisoki's tactical brilliance, Go-Daigo was kind of stupid, and a tactical error during a crucial battle led to Kunisoki's demise. His famous last words were, "Would that I had 7 lives to give for my country." Fittingly, he currently has 2 wickedly cool statues, one in front of the temple Kashinji, and the other in front of the current Japanese Imperial Palace. Number 8. Kondo Isami. A member of the Shinsengumi, Kondo Isami started life as a relatively well-known scholar and exceptional swordsman. He then rose to fame after a gang of thieves broke into his family home, which he supposedly defeated single-handedly. From there, he was trained as a swordsman, but wouldn't see action until the establishment of the Shinsengumi, where he was established as a teacher of swordsmanship and eventually made a full member. From there, he was embroiled in the conflict born from the dissolution of the Tokugawa shogunate, and while the Shinsengumi were disbanded, at that point he managed to retain a similar rank and title. From there, he was essentially forced on the back foot, and in 1868 Kondo was captured and executed under the pretense of having murdered Sakamoto Ryoma. Number 7. Sakamoto Ryoma. Mastering the sword at a young age, Sakamoto worked as a teacher of kenjutsu until the political situation in Japan took a turn for the worse. Sakamoto joined a number of anti-shogunate forces, and is credited with a number of assassination attempts, some of which did succeed, though he was known as someone who generally believed that the shogun should serve the people. He would later be assassinated by a group of attackers, who slaughtered Sakamoto and his friend Nakaoka Shintaro. The Shinsengumi was accused of the murder, leading to Kondo Isami's execution. A pro-shogun group called Miwari-gumi would confess to the murder 3 years later, but the true assassin was never found. Sakamoto's gained fame as something of a Clint Eastwood-style character in modern fiction ever since. Number 6. Yasuke. While Japan was famed for its isolation, there were many ports in which trade did occur. One of these trades was the slave trade, where Nobunaga happened upon a man who would have been extremely peculiar to his eyes. Yasuke's exact origins are unknown, but as most of the slaves traded in the area were originally from Mozambique, it's generally a solid theory that he'd have come from there, specifically the people of Yao, though others claim that Sudan and Ethiopia could have served as his homeland just as well. Either way, Nobunaga was introduced to Yasuke, originally thinking that his skin must have been painted. Accompanying a missionary, Yasuke learned Japanese and eventually became a retainer of Nobunaga, becoming the warlord's weapon bearer. We'll get more into Nobunaga later, but Yasuke was known to have been with him at the end of the warlord's life. Beyond that, Yasuke's fate is unknown, as the traitor Akechi did not kill him for quoted reasons that are gross and kind of racist, and I will not say because ew.
5. The Limping Lady. World War II was the cause and effect for a lot of things. If you like spies and espionage, it's kind of where it all started. One of the best spies who did more than her fair share was Virginia Hall, a lady with a peg leg who thwarted German plans again and again, with her sidekick and peg leg nicknamed Cuthbert. She was credited by top German officials as being the most dangerous spy of all time. In one OSS report, her team is credited with destroying 4 bridges, derailing a freight train, and neutralizing 150 enemies, with hundreds more captured. Now, I'm not a world-class detective or anything, but I feel like if you're trying to find the female spy with a peg leg, it isn't that hard, on account of, some pretty specific identifying features. I don't know how you messed that up. Where is the lady? Where is her? And you hear her walking down the hall. She got a peg leg. What do you mean? Number 4, Miss General. Fu Hao was one of 60 wives to Emperor Wu Ding, which I'm not sure even Mormons can figure that out. But to avoid obscuring into the background like TV's least favorite sister wife, she took control. According to records, she led many successful military campaigns and commanded an army of 13,000. While stories of the past can get lost, this is most likely true, as her tomb was full of many different weapons like great axes, which was common to bury distinguished generals with at the time. When I'm buried as a warrior princess, I want my collection of pop figures to come with me. I spent too much time on those bad boys to not take them with me to the afterlife. Number 3. Fatality. Tamiris was the queen of Mazagate, or at least I think that's how it's pronounced, a confederation of nomadic tribes that lived east of the Caspian Sea. She ruled during the 6th century BC and is most famous for her vengeful war she waged against the Persian king Cyrus the Great. At first, the war wasn't going too great. Unfortunately, her son claimed his life out of shame for losing in battle. Mom was not happy and promised the bloodiest battle ever. Well, she wasn't lying. As the promised battle was very bloody, many Persians perished in battle, including Cyrus. When his body was recovered, the vengeful queen harnessed the power of mid-90s fighting games and removed his head and turned his skull into a cup and proclaimed, "Drink your fill of blood." Nice. Number 2. The beautiful samurai. What does it mean to be a samurai? Armor, a kick-ass sword, and a code of honor? Yes, it does. And Tomoe Gozen did it all and had time to look good doing it. Tomoe Gozen's life is shrouded in mystery and many debate her existence, but whatever be the case, she did leave a mark on history. A very red-stained mark on history. Earning the respect of the men around her, it was stated that she had long black hair and a fair complexion and was in command of a large number of men. However, her biggest claim to fame, when she was approached by multiple foes, she rode right at them, grabbing their leader and liberating his head from his shoulders. Wow, you slay it, queen. Number 1, who else could it go to but the Maid of Orleans? All the badass women who went through a lot on this list, they seen some stuff, honey. But Joan of Arc, girl, she takes the cake. Joan was born a poor peasant but had a unique gift. She could speak to the gods, and the gods told her it was her time to shine. By the time she was 19, she had led thousands of men to battle and in glorious victory. Charles VII, losing the 100 Years' War at the time, said, "Alright, sure, send the girl to fight. What have we got to lose?" Well, they actually had a lot to win. Once Joan had gotten involved, the French began to win victory after victory, and her claims of being guided by God didn't seem so far-fetched after all. The British, being so shaken up by the young girl's military prowess, thought she had been possessed by the devil. The British, not liking losing war to a teenage girl, decided to treat her with compassion by keeping her warm with a fire while she was tied to a wooden post. Joan would later become a legend for her efforts, because getting burned at the stake is honestly a lot and I can't even deal.
Number 10. Nakano Takeko. A shrewd tactician and highly skilled warrior, Nakano was inspired from a young age by the stories of the famed Onimusha Tomoe Gozen. Initially working to teach royal women how to use the naginata, a pole weapon that resembles a cross between a sword and a spear, Nakano would be embroiled within the Boshin War. This civil war saw the Tokugawa shogunate clash with imperial forces. Now, siding with the Tokugawa, she armed herself with a white weapon and gathered a group of women to fight alongside her. This group was dubbed the Joshitai, fighting independently from the main army due to discriminatory rules set by the officials. Famously, at a skirmish at Yanagi Bridge, the Joshitai faced down a squad of imperial troops who, when seeing that their enemies were women, were ordered not to shoot. This brilliant idea was followed up by Nakano easily dispatching between 5 and 6 soldiers single-handedly, the rest of the Joshitai dealing massive damage to the force. Number 9. Lady True. In 226, when Sun Quan sent soldiers to take control of the Jiaoji region, he couldn't have possibly predicted what he'd end up running into. Organizing a rebellion, Lady True gathered 1,000 followers with the goal of revolution. When her brother attempted to prevent her from doing this, Lady True said the coolest thing I've ever heard from a human being. "I'd like to ride storms, kill orcas in the open sea, drive out the aggressors, conquer the country, undo the ties of serfdom, and never bend my back to be the concubine of whatever man." What happened from there isn't terribly well recorded, but it was stated that she fought from the back of a white elephant and may have also been 9 feet tall. That might be fictitious, but regardless, her name has become synonymous as a symbol of rebellion in Vietnam. Number 8. Queen Tuta. Bluntly, it's hard to find good accounts of Tuta's time as a queen, as both of the historians of the time were a little rude. Nevertheless, Queen Tuta rose to power after the death of Angron, becoming the Queen of Illyria. Securing her territory from rebellion, her army also happened to capture a Greek city on their return. Alongside this, Illyria was known for practicing piracy, which strained Greek and Roman trade. Ambassadors were sent to Illyria to negotiate with Tuta, who claimed that stopping the piracy would counter many long-held Illyrian beliefs. Now, one ambassador lost his temper, insulting Tuta to the point where she had them killed. Rome had its reason, and Illyria went to war. Unfortunately, the war was lost due to her forces being spread thin and the betrayal of a local governor. Number 7. Cynene. Born the half-sister of Alexander the Great, Cynene was a warrior princess who commanded the Macedonian armies with a skill second to none. She was recorded defeating an Illyrian queen and army, as well as the remnants of her half-brother's forces led by Alcitas. What little there is that is known of her reign, it is known that she plotted to marry her daughter to Philip Arrhidaeus, surrendering herself to Alcetus in order to delay the oncoming troops while her daughter was wed. Alcetus executed her, but she was so respected by his troops, who had the ones who, had been her enemy, that they rioted against their commander, which fulfilled Cynene's final wishes. Her daughter, Eurydice, would become another famed warrior queen and be buried next to her mother. Number 6. Grace O'Malley. Born to the O'Malley clan in the 1500s, Grace O'Malley earned a fearsome reputation as the pirate queen. Head of the O'Malley clan, she began life as an extremely headstrong woman, one tale of her youth being that she was refused from one of her father's expeditions to Spain due to her long hair potentially getting caught in the ropes, to which she just responded by cutting off all her hair. She defeated clans Joyce and McMahon and became a menace to England, famed for meeting Queen Elizabeth I to negotiate the release of her captured sons. The tales of these negotiations are widespread and also really sick, like how she was caught in the palace with a dagger on her person, or how she was given a lace tissue to sneeze into, which she did, and then promptly tossed into a fireplace. In the end, she won her sons back and was given control of her land, employed as one of the world's first privateers under the crown.
Number 5. Fletcher. I used to be an adventurer like you until I took an arrow to the knee. Somebody had to make these bad boys. Archery. It was an important part of medieval life. Just look at the long bowmen of England. They'll tell you. Bows and arrows may not be the first thing you think of when talking about Vikings, but judging from text, art, and other evidence suggests that archery played a major role in Viking life. Chances are, if you saw a longboat coming into your shores, there would be some burly blonde-haired dudes with bows ready to find their targets. There's a part of me that thinks this is one time the player can blame the controller, or the arrows for that matter. Not every arrow is going to be perfect, so if something goes wrong, you can go back to base and yell at Youngrold.
Number 4. Law speaker. So, in Viking life, there were some rules and laws that applied to all Vikings, and some that were specific to each village or town. But they didn't have law books. There wasn't any kind of written law at all. No, instead, one lad from each town would go have the special task of being the law speaker. This was one person in town who would have the lovely job of memorizing every naughty thing that the members of the village weren't allowed to do. When a council meeting, which was literally called a thing, took place, he was there to remind everyone of any law that was forgotten, or to listen and memorize new laws that were made. Then he would waltz on down to the village law rock and recite that law to everyone who was not part of the thing. Now, imagine if you forgot a law. Or if you worded it differently and that caused someone to find a loophole. Or imagine if you were someone who the law speaker didn't like. That guy could mess up your whole day. If the punishment for a crime was not death, it was sure damn close enough, being exiled into the cold, harsh wilderness. Look, the Vikings came into contact with enough cultures who made a habit of writing things down. Get with the program.
Number 3, thrall. Hey, I don't like it. Nobody likes it. It's YouTube's least favorite S word, forced manual labor. Or, you know what I'm talking about. Vikings were kind of twisted in that department, honestly. Like Adam said, sometimes for fun, they take you away for some good old-fashioned manual labor. Also, like Adam said, this was a very successful and profitable business strategy. If there weren't laws that made employers pay a minimum wage, well, I'd hate to see a world without those laws, you know what I'm saying? It's a terrible thing to find yourself in. While there were some sort of sick buyback freedom program going on, the thrall system does echo with serfdom in the rest of Europe, which if you look around isn't around anymore, probably for good reason.
Number 2, traders. Vikings weren't just mindless brutes who would run around plunging their axes and swords into people, getting drunk and wearing little to no clothing. I mean, yes, there was a fair share of that, but they were also very handy, excellent craftsmen and explorers. As they grew, some towns became trading centers, importing and exporting goods from lands far away. Through Russia, Vikings came into contact with Chinese and Persian traders who gave them spices and fine silks and amber. They would barter with things like weapons, furs, walrus ivory, and fish. They managed to get wine from France and Germany. But while these Vikings decided to trade in the danger of robbing for a more diplomatic profession, they still had to travel. And while they may be making hella bank, that doesn't really matter when you and your longboat carrying all your goods ends up at the bottom of the ocean. Like we said earlier in the video, Vikings were amazing boat builders, but they were not masters of the elements. And if Thor decides it's time for a storm, or if pirates got you in their sights, you gotta deal with the consequences.
Number 1, beekeeping. I'll admit it, I may be a cute husky guy who reminds people of other overweight comedians. I love Candy and Farley too, and maybe sometimes I fart too much. But as it turns out, I have some fears too. I know, who would have thought? One thing I'm not cool with is flying insects, especially the ones that can hurt you. I don't like those ones. Bees and wasps, ironic, I know, my little honeybees, I know, right? Who would have thought? I've never been stung before and I don't plan on it. With my luck, Adam's a supervillain with thousands of bees at his disposal. Who knows? With all jokes aside, the Vikings had honey, which probably means they had some sort of beekeeping going on. We're not sure, however, how they did it. What I do know, though, is that they had no protection or smoke blowers. Maybe they did. Tell you what, I'll enjoy the honey and let the crazy burly men take care of the harvesting.
At number 10, cutting fingernails. Each civilization had their own specific beliefs, religions, and rites. For the Vikings, their belief in Norse mythology impacted a lot of their daily lives and even their burial rituals. One specific prophecy from their religion depicted the end of the world, and as anyone would, they tried to avoid that at all costs. In Norse mythology, Ragnarok was their version of the end of the world, and during this event it was foretold that a lot of stuff was gonna happen, like giants and demons approaching and attacking the gods, and a ship called Nagfar would carry a fleet of giants. This ship was said to be made of the fingernails and toenails of the dead, and the bigger the ship, the more giants would come. Out of fear of this happening, the Vikings took every precaution to prevent Ragnarok and subsequently the arrival of this fingernail ship. To do this, the Vikings built into their burial rites a very important step, cutting the fingernails of the dead. The Vikings had to remove the fingernails of the dead so that they couldn't be used to build the giant ship, but other than their removal, no one really knows what they did with said fingernails. The Vikings were also said to have kept their own fingernails clean as to prevent the same outcome. At number 9, teeth filing. Many civilizations had body modifications as part of their culture through time. Mesoamerican civilizations were known to shape their skulls and alter their eyes, women in China altered the shapes of their feet for many years, and so many cultures around the world adorned themselves with tattoos, piercings, and scarifications. In Viking culture, their body modifications often included dental work. Evidence suggests that some Vikings filed horizontal lines into their teeth, and some of them filled those grooves with red dye to make themselves look even more terrifying. Because the Vikings were known to be voyagers traveling the seas to new lands, some anthropologists believe that the Vikings may have picked up their idea for dental modification after making contact with people in West Africa, as many tribes over there were known to file their teeth into different shapes. Would you guys ever do something like this, or would you rather leave that up to the Vikings? Now before I continue telling you guys about the weird and crazy things that the Vikings did, let me first ask you guys to leave a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and maybe also consider subscribing to the channel to see more awesome videos like this one. At number 8, carbon monoxide. The Vikings were pretty good builders, mainly of ships. Their ships were huge, intricate, and very impressive, but where they excelled in shipbuilding, they lacked in the construction of their homes and community buildings. Apparently, the longhouses that they built for their communities were actually pretty unsafe to be in and trapped a lot of toxic gases inside of them. Researchers from a university in Denmark recreated one of the Vikings' longhouses and lit a fire in the center of it, like the Vikings would have done back in the day. After simulating an average living environment and monitoring the atmosphere inside of the longhouse, they realized that there wasn't enough ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide from building up inside. This would have led to a lot of people getting sick, especially those who spent long periods of time inside. The Vikings didn't know that though, but they also had their own remedies for curing sickness, so I don't think that they would have thought much of it. At number 7, onion soup. Speaking of Viking home remedies though, they had some pretty interesting ones. Every civilization had their own takes on medicine and healing their sick and injured, and the Vikings were no doubt the same. For them though, soup was their tool for healing, and for x-rays. Sort of. These days we eat soup when we're sick to warm up our bodies and balance out our sodium levels, and doctors have actually proven that eating chicken soup actually does make you feel better when you have a cold, but Vikings didn't really have the same idea. For them, onion soup was their thing, and they used it to diagnose people. Viking healers would make up a pot of really strong onion soup and feed it to a warrior who had a wound around their abdomen. Once the person drank the soup, the healer would see if they could smell the soup through the wound. If he could, then the wound was fatal and there was no sense in trying to save the person, so they would just move on to the next warrior. It saved the healer time trying to attend to everyone, but it kinda sucked for the person who got left behind, because not only are they not going to make it, but their last meal was that awful onion soup. At number 6, blood eagle. We all know that the Vikings were a ruthless group of people, but their methods of execution really painted a clear picture of how terrifying these guys were and how they had a colorful imagination when it came to imagining new ways to unalive somebody. The Vikings came up with a method of execution called the blood eagle, and yes, it is just as terrifying as you would expect with a name like that. The blood eagle basically involved cutting someone up to make it look like an eagle. They would cut apart the rib cage and then spread it apart to make it look like wings, and then after that, while this person was still alive mind you, they would pour a salt solution over the wound, pull out the lungs, and arrange them over the rib cage to, again, make it look like wings so that this person could flutter away into the afterlife. Now the mysterious part of all this is that historians aren't exactly sure if this was actually a real method of execution or if it was just embellished in Viking records to make them sound cooler. I, for one, hope that it wasn't actually real because that sounds brutal, but when it comes to Vikings, you never really know.
Number 5, tarring and feathering. Okay, we've all heard about this one. It's brutal, of course, but the most shocking part is how many steps this one involves. You know what I mean? Like, you'd think at the feather part, one guy would be plucking, like, what are we doing? This is insane. I have to go home. It's been hours here. This is horrible. This one goes as far back as 832 AD. This disgusting act has been going down for quite a while. Again, it's so many steps. This is horrible. Who invented this? A man stealing on trade journeys was to be tarred and feathered. This was for stealing during journeys. Again, this is what I'm saying about steps here. First, you'd have to shave this Viking's head, which I don't know if you've seen a Viking recently, but that's gonna take a minute. A lot of hair, sure. Then, said Viking was covered in tar, and then duck feathers chucked on top. Then, as if it couldn't get much worse, this poor guy covered in feathers and tar was forced to run between two lines of the men that he lived with and stole from. Now, at that point, these other guys would throw stones, bricks, anything painful, you name it. Now, anybody caught not throwing an object at the feathery fellow was liable to be fined. So I know it sucks, but grab something and grab it quick. If the thief did make it through this line alive, again, after being tarred and feathered, then he was off the hook from there on out. Then he was, I guess, innocent? I don't know. That's horrible. I wouldn't make that, no way. Number 4, trial by ordeal. Quite the ordeal indeed. Look, I mentioned ordeal by fire earlier, and that's quite a hot mess. But trial by ordeal is, I have no words. Humans are so stupid, honestly. Introduced after Christianity, wild. Trial by ordeal was used as a test to determine whether someone was innocent or guilty. And yeah, spoiler alert, it was in fact not foolproof at all. In fact, it made absolutely zero sense at all. Basically, the accused accused would be placed into the center of everybody, and then they would have severe pain inflicted upon them in a multitude of ways. Like, they all just beat this person up. It was horrible, to say the least. If they survived all this pain, they were innocent, and if they didn't, then they were guilty. Who wrote the rule book on this? That doesn't make any sense. What kind of insanity is going on here? But wait, it gets even better. If their wounds were clean and without infection after 3 days, then they would be found innocent because it was a sign that the gods had intervened to show their innocence. So yeah, a lot of steps to be proven innocent. And healing apparently is one of them. Who knew? Number 3, no insults. Yeah, the YouTube comments section could take a note from this one. Here we go. No insults. Be nice. This one's pretty good. This would change the game today. If you hurled insults at somebody back in the Viking Age, well, they were entitled to compensation. And they could summon everybody else who's around at the time to be a witness. Yeah, they could be like, hey, you hurt my feelings, give me $10. I guess that is happening today, but on a much larger scale. Comedians, really. If you spoke bad about somebody during the Viking Age, even if the person wasn't there, it could ruin their reputation, right? And because of that, you need to pay them for the possible damages. Again, we see this happen today in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't even matter if the insult was true either. It's too late, right? You spoke it, now it's out there. You did it. Your reputation was how you gained employment, met friends. It was a really important thing back then, more important than now. Can't be messed with, especially if you're a Viking. Yeah, no way. Also, if you insulted one man, you insulted his entire family as well. You know, the whole Viking rule. There were some words, however, where a man would be allowed to kill you if you said them to him. So yeah, choose wisely, I guess, with your insults. Number 2, rap battles. Before we get to our big bad number 1 spot on today's list, we have to mention the best part of Viking tradition, in my humble opinion. Battles, but with words. Not with our fists, with our emotions. Flighting, or rap battles, or my favorite part of history, I would have killed it, honestly. I was writing some before lunch and I think I'm okay. During those days, you needed ways to pass time, right? If you couldn't play hockey and there weren't any villages to destroy, what does a Viking do? Why, you have loud poetry, that's what you do. Flighting comes from the Old Norse flyta, meaning provocation. It's basically insult exchange, but make it theater. Now it's just ASAP Rocky. Norse literature really has tales of their gods flighting. Imagine that. Imagine how cool that would be. Imagine the next season of Loki and he's battling Freya in some sort of rap circle, some cipher. That'd be amazing. The whole purpose here was not to see who could diss the other's hometown the hardest, but rather this was a challenge in order to see who can spontaneously think of a poetic retort. It's all brains and no brawn. A little different than traditional Viking battles, right? In Anglo-Saxon England, flighting would go down during a great feast. Imagine that, you'd enjoy a roast while watching a roast in real life. Double the roast, double the fun. Later, this was of course entertainment in the 15th and 16th centuries in Scotland. But don't get it twisted, Viking flighting got pretty intense. And finally, number 1, the blood eagle. The best/worst for last. Here we go. This was a ritual method of execution that was detailed in late skaldic poetry. Again, if you're eating food right now, maybe give it a break for a minute. I don't know, giving you a heads up. In the 2 instances where this horrible punishment was mentioned, the victims, historically, who both happened to be members of the royal family, they were both in the prone position, right? So they would lie flat on their tummies, then they would have their ribs severed from their spine using a sharp tool, then they had their lungs pulled out through the opening to create this sort of like, wings, I guess. Just like a nice lungy pair of wings. We love a creative Viking, I guess. Now, both instances where this insane punishment is said to have went down, historically, both of them were accused of killing their own fathers. So I don't know what was going on back then or who's doing what, but we've got some daddy issues that are not being handled well at all. So don't do that, I guess. Don't do any part of that at any time. Again, how many steps goes into lunging somebody? I can barely carve a pumpkin in one go. You know what I mean? My wrist gets tired. I can't do that. It's a lot of work.
Number 10, Queen of the Red Sails. In history, when men drop the ball, there's always an iron-willed woman to pick up the slack. Not because a man is telling her to, but because she wants to. How about inheriting a whole pirate fleet from your late husband? Meet Zhang Yisao. Her husband had managed to build quite the little nautical empire, and with his untimely passing, she became the boss. She commanded a fleet of over 400 ships, and estimated between 20 to 60,000 pirates at her peak. She's noted for organizing and uniting pirates into a confederation. She also had some imperial entanglements, having entered conflict with the East India Company and the Portuguese Empire. This is a lot to go through, especially when I get anxiety from being left alone at the cashier at the grocery store. Number 9, Double Trouble. The Trung sisters from Vietnam are still celebrated today because, honey, they went through a lot. The sisters led the first resistance against Chinese dominance, which at the time had lasted over 247 years. Many believe Vietnam wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for their efforts, gathering 80,000 people to join their cause, once killing a tiger and writing a proclamation of war on its hide. They managed to hold off the Chinese forces for 3 years before finally being overtaken. The Trunk sisters are a great deal of national pride and pride amongst many women in Vietnam. Sadly, the Chinese proved too strong, but to prevent capture, the sisters later drowned in a last fit of defiance. Number 8. Hell hath no fury. The Roman Empire was just about good at everything. Politics, culture, building a city that would stand the test of time, and eventually outlive their civilization. But perhaps the Romans' strongest attribute was their military. I mean, come on, it's Rome, no introduction is needed here. So when a man was worried that the Romans he had worked with might take over his homeland after he had passed, he left a note in his will saying, "Please do not take this. This is mine, don't take it." I'll give the folks at home a second to think about what the Romans did next. If you guessed annex his homeland and do non-YouTube friendly conduct things to his wife and daughter, you'd be correct. His wife Boudica, not feeling so cool about what happened, took some action by gathering the tribe together and revolting against the Romans. Defeating the scrambled Romans in a battle, she then made her way to Londinium, or what's now London, and had it burned. There were empires that couldn't take down the Roman Empire, and Boudica did it like it was nothing. They did end up losing and, once again to avoid capture, drank poison. But come on, she took down the Romans. Number 7. Viva la Revolucion. Juana de Paria was born in Spanish-controlled Peru to 2 loving parents. Like many classic stories, her mother sadly passed away when she was young, where she grew very attached to her father. Although unusual for the time, her father instructed her on how to horse ride and sharpshoot. Even helped her father work during the days. They were pretty tight, but like an M. Night Shyamalan movie, there's a double twist. Her father passed away in her teens. Now an orphan, she was forced to move in with her aunt, where she quite possibly developed the very first feelings of teenage angst before there was ever an Avril Lavigne album. Juana would often have outbursts that got her eventually sent to become a nun, where that also did not go very well. During her studies, she was fond of Joan of Arc, but eventually she was expelled at the young age of 17. After years of witnessing colonial reign, she joined the revolution. She became so passionate about the cause, she once fought a battle while pregnant, went back to have a baby, and then went back to battle with the baby strapped to her back. Man, sometimes I don't even want to get up after a large meal. What a woman! Number 6. Not one step back. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was just like any other girl in Russia in the 1940s. She was in her last year of university when history's favorite mustache man invaded history's second favorite mustache man. Feeling inspired by her country's call to arms, she signed up for military service. She would eventually find her way to be a sharpshooter. During the siege of Odessa, she is credited with 187 confirmed kills. She married a fellow sniper, he died, then she went on to have over 300 confirmed kills when the war was over. Once the military realized how valuable she was pulled from the front lines, where she became key propaganda for Russia. She would also find herself training young snipers up until the end of the war. She was oftentimes referred to as the Lady of Death. Number 5. Alexander the Great. Everyone has ups and downs except for Alexander the Great. Besides a few skirmishes here and there, he was pretty much undefeated. That's a pretty good record. But he was like 10-0, and if this was Call of Duty Search and Destroy, that's good enough for me. The Macedonian prince's empire stretched thousands of miles from Greece to northern Africa, Persia, and even some parts of India. He accomplished all of this at a very, very young age. So, you know, get off your lazy butt and do something. That means me too. I just love being a homebody, what can I say? Although, I do enjoy the odd drinky poo with friends. There's a famous quote, and I think this explains pretty much all of it. "And Alexander wept, for he had no more worlds to conquer." Tragic. It's hard being a #1 top ancient warrior guy. It really is. It's really hard. Number 4. Mad Jack Churchill. This guy needs to be talked about more, man. He's so awesome. WW2. Germany was back for the sequel, and this time with its other tough guy friend Japan and their little paisano Italy. The boys were back in town and ready to party. Mad Jack Churchill got the invitation and brought some party favors with him. What did he bring, you're asking? Well, my fellow humble bumblebees, he brought a sword and a bow and bagpipes with him, which, if you didn't know, that's ancient stuff. but he brought it to a modern war. What? What's so weird about it? This is World War II. Swords and bows just aren't it anymore. They don't belong there. In fact, Mad Jack Churchill has the last recorded longbow D-Life in history. He has been noted to play Scotland the Brave when the enemy had him in their sights. He was captured multiple times and escaped multiple times, walking like thousands of miles to get out of there. Kind of crazy. When the war ended, he was genuinely upset it was over. He thought it was more of a game. Hollywood, if you're listening, someone make this movie or TV show. I'll play him. I'll do it. I'll come play him Scotland the Brave. Number 3, Genghis Khan. Sometimes in life you make an impact in history. Sometimes you do so much it's hard not to talk about you. Genghis got to write his own history. The ruthless and powerful warrior from the Mongol Empire. Basically, it goes down like this. You got something he wants, albeit land to camp on, people for his empire, or just riches in general. Now, while he deletes your village and kingdom, you got 2 options. Option 1, if you don't agree with the terms and conditions of option 2, then the chaos of option 1 continues. Or option 2, assimilate into our empire or refer to the consequences of option 1. Ooh, I'll take option 2 thanks, I like to live. But keep your religious freedom though for some reason. He let people keep their religious freedom, which is kind of cool. Even for a bloodthirsty monster, he was kind of cool with that. So gold star, buddy, gold star. And of course the classic fact that he did so much bedroom stuff that his DNA is still with us today and has way too many descendants than we like to admit. That's just crazy, man. That's insanity. That's insanity. Number 2, Navy SEALs. Oh baby, some real slick frogmen. These are the guys that are sent behind enemy lines and gather vital intelligence. Some of the best of the best. It doesn't get tougher than the Navy SEALs. Finding their roots in the Vietnam War, the Navy SEALs have been one of the toughest special forces the United States has ever seen. They've been involved in almost every major conflict the US has found themselves entangled with for the last 60 years. For me, when I think Navy SEALs, I think of the classic PS2 game. Remember that? Remember that game? I remember that game. It's pretty sick. Let's put that game back. The game was super ahead of its time. And number 1, Spits and Us. The spearhead of Russian special forces. These are tough guys with a tough history and ironically enough to mirror the history of the previously mentioned Navy SEALs. Getting their start as advisors to the VC in the Vietnam War and of course being a part of every major conflict the Soviet Union was a part of, and even the ones you may not know about. There's also a common rumor that the Spetsnaz trainees are given a pet. Sometimes it's a chicken or it's a dog, not too sure there, the information's not great, which kind of hurts the validity of the rumor, but the point stands nonetheless. Their duty is to basically raise and love and nurture this pet until an officer instructs them to take the pet to greener pastures. Yeah, no thanks.
Number 10, Thrall traders. Now look, Vikings weren't all that bad. Sure, they would go off to other countries and lands and raid and pillage for a bit of sport. They'd de-life you and your family, or they would take the people from your village that could do some good manual labor and bring them back to the market where they were sold to other Vikings as thralls. But okay, you know what? Yeah, I'm not really making this any better. The selling and purchasing of actual people has unfortunately been a successful business strategy in almost every single corner of the world for as long as there have been people to do it. And the Vikings were not exempt from this. While it was a standard way of living at the time, the people who actually auctioned off thralls for silver and gold pieces or for goods like furs, weapons, livestock, and food, by our standards, were the worst of people. To make the life of another human being nothing more than a product is pretty disgusting. Gotta love how people just always treat each other so nicely. Life for a Viking thrall was anything but pleasant, but they were a part of Viking society. We'll get to that later though.
Number 9, hunters. Yes, a lot of Scandinavian life had domesticated animals. We wouldn't be here without that. But this isn't the time of industrial agriculture. You can't just walk into your local butcher and demand to speak to the manager when there's a lack of product. Trouble is, I think a lot of modern folks just don't know how difficult the process of hunting can be. Now, hunting is a way of R&R, a unique hobby that can give you a respect of nature and where your food comes from. Or it's a way to binge drink in a small cabin with 3 other men trying to get away from their wives. Vikings just didn't have it that easy. No catch, no food. For my taste though, in a time before gunpowder and rifles, stick to the small animals. Trying to take down a bear with arrows, that just can't be easy.
Number 8, shipbuilders. Vikings got around. All around, not just Europe, but a large part of the known world, even discovering places all by themselves. They were experts at building boats. They had dragon ships, nars, merchant ships, and a whole bunch of other kinds of water vehicles. But the most famous of all their ships would be their longboats. They used longboats to travel the world and to go on their famous vacations when they would go Viking. The dudes responsible for building these things are also responsible for the nightmares they gave all the monks and soldiers who lived in England and other European countries, assuming they survived. Imagine, it's a nice, crisp morning. You're just waking up for the long day ahead of you. You step outside to take it all in. Oh, what's that in the distance? A large, flat-bottomed oak boat with the head of a serpent or a dragon, with 50 to 60 large, hairy, sweaty, angry-looking men who are coming to put you in the ground or kidnap you, take your stuff, and burn your house to the ground? You know who you have to thank for this? Yeah, it's the Viking shipbuilder.
Number 7, blacksmith. Being a blacksmith is a very difficult task. Red hot iron, hammers striking and forging the metal that makes our lives possible. Sure, we don't use them as much as we did in the past, but someone's gotta make horseshoes. Shout out to all the equine lovers out there. I see you. The point I'm getting to here is that in a time before power hammers and modern techniques, it's a long process. Takes time and skill. Some might even call blacksmithing an artisan craft, especially since a lot of the things that required a blacksmith to be a blacksmith, like making swords obviously, and shields and spears, but you gotta think about everything else. Door hinges, iron fittings, bolts, brackets. It's an important job in the Iron Age. What's messed up is how dangerous it is. Anyone working with metal will tell you how rough that can be. In a time before hospitals, burn treatments, and antibiotics, I would be careful on the grind wheel.
Number 6, settlers. Life in the Scandinavian countries was not easy. Summers were like 2 days long, and winters would last so long Andrew could actually move his box over to finish filming on time.
Hey!
A large percent of the Vikings were farmers, but the soil there was not good. So, as more and more Vikings were born and families grew, some people decided to jump ship and move away. Or try to. They'd show up in England like, "Hi, so I know we kinda just like totally raided you or whatever, but we would love your land and we're gonna settle here, okay? Cool." This was usually met with the pointy end of a 3-foot sword. They would settle in areas like Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, and Russia. Some successfully, some not so much. They did successfully settle Iceland and Greenland though, with their population in Iceland reaching like 50,000. When they went to Vinland, otherwise known as Newfoundland, they settled for about 5 minutes before the Native Americans drove them out. Being a settler back in the time of the Viking was a necessity for some, but a death wish for most.
Number 5. How to ward off Draugr. Draugr, for those who didn't play Skyrim, are a Viking denomination of the undead. It's presumed as a certainty that when a person is buried in the ground, they will rise from the dead as a Draugr. From there, they'll attack people, and everyone will generally have a bad time until the Draugr is killed via decapitation, dismemberment, or any act of making it just not move anymore. To prevent this from happening in the first place, Viking land burials were done extremely carefully. Straw would be placed under the body and scissors would be laying on the chest, while their toes were sewn together and nails were pushed through their feet. They would then deconstruct a portion of the house and take the corpse out through it, reconstructing it later, as Draugr were believed to follow the path back from their place of burial. They would then be entombed, and all of the items they'd owned that remained in their house would be turned upside down until their grave was magically sealed. Number 4. Berserkers. A denomination of shamans, berserkers were warriors trained to fight and channel various spirits into their body. There were 3 schools of berserker: the wolf, boar, and bear, each one serving a slightly different role. To train, these berserkers were sent out into the wilderness to become more in tune with nature, and also drive themselves insane in the process. This would supposedly imbue them with the strengths of their respective school of combat, and so when they were called upon to enter into Norse conflicts, they were supposedly given the ability to transform into their respective animal, ripping the opposing warriors to shreds. This account is shared both by Vikings and the victims of Vikings, though it is more than likely that this is just an exaggeration meant to imply the bestial behavior of a berserker when in a trance. Number 3. The Blood Eagle. This one is not for the faint of heart. A ritualistic form of execution, the Blood Eagle is an extremely violent method of dispatching enemies, which is described in the sagas. For a long period of time, these were thought to have been fictional, but as recent bodies have been unearthed that appear to have been victims of the Blood Eagle, there seems to be more truth to this than initially thought. The Blood Eagle involves the victim being laid on their front and a knife being used to separate their ribs from their spine. The spine is then removed and their lungs are spread out in the form of crimson wings, creating the eponymous Blood Eagle. Number 2. The Bloat. The Bloat was set as a ritual that would occur once every season at 4 set intervals in a year, but another could be organized if circumstances required it. The most well-recorded bloat was one performed by Sigurd Håkonsson. Detailed by Snorri Sturluson in the saga of Håkon the Good, this ritual involved a massive amount of human and animal sacrifices, as well as sacrifices of weaponry. Blood was also collected and splattered on the walls, altars, and participants. A feast would then be had and toasts would be made, first to the gods and then to the fallen. Number 1. Viking chief cremation ceremonies. We've all heard of Viking cremations, how they load their dead bro onto the ship and sail it out into the ocean, sending a flaming arrow into it so that they might be buried at sea. However, if it was a chief that died, things would get a little bit more screwed up and nasty. First off, one of the chief's girls would then volunteer or be volunteered to join the chief in the afterlife. She would then be made to get mad drunk and then would be made to sleep with every single man in the village. Seriously. She would then be strangled, stabbed, and loaded onto the boat and the whole fire thing would go down. What can I say except what?
Kicking off our list at number 10, stealing. Stealing today, okay, I mean, it depends what you take, and most of the time, your family doesn't end up abandoning you in the woods, right? I mean, hopefully, right? The Vikings, they didn't play around. Materials were sparse back then. It was hard to replace stolen goods, and the deed of stealing back in the Viking Age had severe consequences. The Vikings believed that if you stole, you were a coward. Yeah, and I kind of agree. My bike got stolen twice growing up. Cowards? Both of them. Maybe it was the same guy, I don't know. Stealing was a different kind of low to Vikings, and I'm sure many of you can see eye to eye with this. But when you steal from somebody, they don't have a chance to defend themselves, right? There's no honor, there's no battle for land, no fight for property, no bout for glory. It's just a shameless act, right? Raiding and stealing were two very different concepts in the Viking Age, because you're probably asking yourself, wait, didn't the Vikings do that horrible stuff where they stole everyone's land? They did, but it was different, apparently. They viewed both differently, although they sound the same in terms of brutality, and someone's losing their home regardless. A stealer would be abandoned from the clan, pushing them out into the woods for around 20 years. Yeah, all because you stole a pine nut. Way to go, Eric the Dumb. Get out of here. Number 9, rodeo. Hold on to your butts for this next one. This one I did not expect, honestly. If you were an early medieval Norseman and somebody insulted your wife, first of all, how dare you? Second of all, the legal punishment afterwards, it can vary, but one of the most bizarre ways to settle your beef, pun intended, was by involving a cow. Yeah, a cow. He came in, he was brought into an area, hopefully a controlled area of sorts, and that's where its tail was shaved and then covered in grease. Poor thing, had nothing to do with any of this, and now he's over here. The man's shoes were also heavily greased, and the cow was prodded to make it upset, right? Sounds like something Johnny Knoxville would do for fun, but it was not fun at all. The rodeo began when the man pulled on the cow's tail, like a bell being rung. Like, here we go, gong, and then he just got whipped away. Now this of course would upset the cow and it would thrash him about. Now if the man at this point can keep hold of the cow's tail for a specified length of time, why, he passed the test of course, and then he was allowed to live on. And you had to keep the cow afterwards. What a weird bonding story, imagine that. Number 8. Taking lives. Yeah, what happens when you do the worst of the worst? I mean, today we dish out quite the punishment. You even get a Netflix special or something like that. But back then, somebody in the Viking Age, well, it kind of wasn't a big deal. I know it sounds horrible to say, but hear me out. Back then, as long as the convicted were open and honest about the whole situation, like say, I don't know, if somebody had challenged him to a duel, why then it's fair game. One specific case from history involved a Viking man catching his wife in bed with another Viking. Not good. You don't want to catch your wife in bed with anyone, let alone a Viking. That's game over. His feet are hanging off your bed. You're like, oh, he's so large. No. That Viking man at that point could the fella in bed, but he had to bring that bloody sheet to Viking court. That would have to provide as evidence to show what happened and where and why. You know what I mean? That's simple. Today there'd be a few more steps involved in that case, obviously. But the Viking Age, this case was closed. That's it. They're like, okay, Viking law is done. Go home. Someone go raid a village. Number 7, hot-headed. All right, here's the deal. We're doing a list on Viking punishments, so as we go on, yeah, we're gonna get darker and darker with our content. For example, one method of punishment in the later Viking Age also happened to spread alongside Scandinavia's conversion to Christianity. So there's some thoughts and some actions, some questionable thoughts and actions going on in history. And this punishment was referred to as an ordeal by fire. This would involve the accused undergoing some painful exposure to heat. Maybe you drown in flames, maybe you have to eat some sort of fire or flame situation. I don't know. Either way, it was all terrible and it was very, very hot. They would have your hand put into a vat of boiling water or oil, or sometimes make you walk across hot coals. And you can only imagine how creative people were getting back then, right? You don't even want to know the rest. Can't even say what happened on YouTube. Use your imagination. Hit that thumbs up and use your imagination. Number 6, piece by piece. Okay, what's worse than ordeal by fire? Well, probably amputation. I'd have to go with the latter for sure. It's close. Definitely. In Viking societies, punishment was often dependent on status. The higher your status, the harder and longer your punishment was. High status folks got some pretty horrible stuff happening to them, honestly. If a thrall carried out a robbery at their master's command, well then it was the master that was punished. So instead of a quick death, they would amputate something. That's horrible. Yeah, continue being a royal, but now your life is going to be much harder. A real life example of such was Nut, the Danish king of England, back from 1016 to 1035. Now the king put in place a horribly grim law that thankfully died with him, but it stipulated back then that a woman committing adultery must lose her nose and ears, while men were merely chastised. Not even close to being fair at all. Now a thrall who had killed their master back then and then tried to run away were to have their arms and legs amputated afterwards. They weren't executed per se, but they could barely survive afterwards. Like I'd rather die at that point. That sounds terrible.
Chunky, slow moving. You sure you don't want some veggies there, Barley Boy? I'm just kidding. Also, gladiators are dead now, so I can't hurt their feelings. Besides, Barley Boy was a real title for the cranky tough guys. Researchers who studied 2,000-year-old skeletal remains of 67 gladiators were able to test them for certain elements, including calcium and zinc. Using scientific method of isotopic analysis, they can reconstructed the diets of the gladiators and discovered that they ate a plant-based, carb-rich diet that included barley and beans, very little animal protein. They also drank calcium supplements made from charred plants. Unlike the modern-day vegan who follows this kind of diet out of ethical motivations or being raised by the nothing tastes better than thin generation mom, gladiators evidently did it for pragmatic reasons. The diet was so curated and consistent that even with different dishes and spices, their diet was consistent enough to be called, you guess it, tradish. Love the puns. Gladiators fell into eating a lot of simple carbs to boost subcutaneous fat, which helped increase their survival chances in battle. Because of this fatty cushion, their blood vessels and nerves were better protected in fights. Whether or not they knew all the big sciencey words to explain it, I couldn't tell you, but they clearly picked up on it. That's what made this become such an indoctrinated diet for the gladiator. It was consistently proven to work, be efficient, and produce results. Besides, meat was for the rich anyway. Thankfully, gladiator medicine evolved after Greece fell to Rome, meaning it was time for some Greek training. The Roman gladiatorial games were a far cry from the Olympic and theatrical pursuits enjoyed in ancient Greece, but the Greeks played an important role in preparing gladiators for their violent contests. After their incorporation into the Roman Empire, the ancient Greeks quickly carved out a little niche for themselves in a multitude of professions. Greek philosophers were employed to educate the sons of wealthy Roman aristocrats, merchants took advantage of the Pax Romana to sell their goods far and wide, and the chefs and bakers got to really blow some sandals off. For Greek athletes and physicians, Roman rule offered other opportunities. Gladiators, who required training and medical care, and the Greeks had the requisite skills to provide them. Their role might have been similar to that of a strength and conditioning coach employed to help modern athletes today. By this time, the ancient Greeks had spent centuries refining their strength and conditioning practices for the Olympics and other games, so the Greek trainers were perfect for this role. They understood kinesiology, diet, regime, all the things that gladiators had been lacking before them. The most comprehensive primary source on gladiator medical medical care comes from Galen, a Greek physician, surgeon, and philosopher who in 167 AD returned to his native city of Pergamon to work as a physician to the gladiators of the High Priest of Asia. According to the historian of medicine, Vivian Nutton, only 2 gladiators died when Galen was operating in Pergamon, whereas 60 had been killed in the tenure of his predecessor. Galen's experience treating wounds and sometimes dying gladiators provided opportunities for medical discoveries. He disproved Aristotle's assertion that the heart was the seat of the reason by observing a dying gladiator who sustained mortal wounds to the heart remained lucid until death. And while having a robust body may save your life, a pretty face sells the case. There were several types of gladiators, the distinctions based on the type of weaponry and tactics, but the most beautiful gladiators were held in high esteem. When the opponents for a gladiator were chosen, their beauty was taken into account. Ugliness ruined the lustrous fascination with viciousness, while beauty simultaneously emphasized the pain of mortality. Real artsy-fartsy, these Romans. The Rotarius, a gladiator fighting with equipment resembling that of a fisherman, was the least armed combatant in the arena, armed with a trident, a dagger, a net. A Rotarius wore nothing but a loincloth, a belt, and a minimal amount of armor. He was considered inferior to other gladiators, literally dubbed unnecessary to kill, and there was an aspect of homosexuality and effeminacy to his appearance and role in battle. He was to represent the ardent love of soft masculine beauty in Roman Greece, placed in the plight of human disgust and sin. Thus, Rotarius would stand out in battle but not be crucial to it. Since Rotarius is not really high on the list of gladiator discussion piles, I'll leave you with Satire 2 and 8, wherein writer Juvenal described Gratius, a man who disgraced himself by becoming the male bridegroom to a horn player. Not the disgrace here, but Juvenal was a massive hater and everyone knows it. A lot of sexist tirades. However, that marriage, like said, was not the embarrassing moment. It was when he fought by choice and effed up his one job as Rotarius, which was to throw the net at the guy. He missed the throw like an effing idiot and was forced to run for his life. Even Gratius' opponent was ashamed to be fighting him. Here's a crazy one, name based off defeat. Hey, to cut all the preamble and get right to it, they literally named all their categories of gladiator types after places they conquered. That's it, that's the show, pack it up, and good night everyone. These gladiators would then fight with some Romanized versions of their traditional weapons and fighting styles, and were sometimes also given a gladiatorial category due to being ethnic themselves, as it was a great way to show off how un-Roman you were when chosen to be an opponent. In creating gladiators of this type to fight for them, the Romans tried to mark out those in the ring as different than them and more deserving of the humiliation of fighting for others' entertainment. So let's learn about a few categories. The people of Gaul, which had roughly covered modern France and Belgium, proved to be a formidable foe to Rome, as demonstrated when they plundered the city in 390 BCE. They were feared by the Romans until conquered by Julius Caesar, and then Gaul became deeply integrated into the empire and as being a wealthy province and provided many members to the Roman elite. So the gladiator was actually renamed the Murmillo to reflect the changing attitude later on. Another type of gladiator was called the Hoplomachus, and he was modeled off the hoplite, the quintessential soldier of the Greek antiquity. They were equipped with a sword, a spear, and a round shield. The Romans encountered the Thracians, who lived in the southeast Balkans between Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey, and to the Romans they were wild and savage, so they modeled that gladiator, the Thrax, as such, with a small rectangular shield, 2 leg greaves, a curved simcar, and a bunch of other weapons. Emperor Caligula was fond of appearing as a Thracian fighter. In his case, it's hard to know if he picked that type as an ethnic connotation or because they were just super cool and scary. And last but never least, who is surprised to hear that traditionally women got the short stick? Literally, they were given short sticks sometimes. Why? Even though we have a very limited history of female gladiators, it can tell us that they were hardcore B-word brawls that put men to shame at first, and transitioned into a spectacle more on par with 2 sorority girls jello wrestling in bikinis. Female gladiators are gladiatrix in modern language, while ancient texts referred to them as Ludia or Molières, weren't as common as their male counterparts, but they did make their way into the ring. They were highly sexualized. Female gladiators only wore loincloths as opposed to the tunics men wore, and they were not given helmets, presumably to show off their faces and hairstyles. Fights featuring female gladiators represented the pinnacle of luxury and indulgence, often present at private parties held by the Roman elite. Unlike their male counterparts, who were often forced into the gladiator life, it's believed gladiatrix chose to fight for financial gain, honor, spite, or fame. Although evidence to support the historical existence isn't vast, it's compelling. Written and archaeological records have survived, including a marble relief and funerary items. One statue, believed to depict a female gladiator, features a bare-chested woman holding a sika, associated with a type of gladiator known as the Thrax. Further substantiating the history of female gladiators is a law that barred free women from participating in the arena games if they were 20 years or younger. The creation of this law was seen as an inadvertent recognition of the fact that women had been participating already. Male gladiators, however, kept hacking away at each other for another 2 centuries before the last recorded gladiatorial contest occurred in 405 404 AD. Fight between these two women, the goddess Achilles and the queen of an Amazon warrior tribe, survives as an interesting example of a serious female contest. An ancient marble relief, now in the British Museum, naturally, shows that these two women fought well and respectively and were both granted their freedom at the end of it.
Number 10. Tar and feather. This is something my mom always said to me when I was being too loud, boisterous, or distracting her from a task at hand. I'm sorry, Mom, it's just what I do. Mind you, looking back, perhaps it wasn't my fault. Perhaps letting a hyper child eat chicken McNuggets and soda after watching a bunch of 007 movies was not the right choice, Mother. I used to be a big 007 fan. After running all over my house, my mom would say, "Son, if you don't settle down, I'm going to tar and feather you." Well, in the times of Vikings, this was a legit punishment and for legit criminals. The crook's head would be shaven and covered in tar, which even that alone sounds horrible. And then a poof, I guess you describe it, of duck feathers was thrown onto his stickiness. He then would have to run through a gauntlet and everyone would be tossing stones and bricks because, well, I guess tar and feathers weren't enough. If you made it out alive, then no further punishment was required. Number 9. Fines. Surprisingly enough, one of the most common punishments of the Viking era was fines. Nothing deters criminals like owing the governing body some cold hard cash. Except a lot of criminals don't really have any money, hence why they would steal in the first place, so owing money isn't exactly a great deterrent in my opinion. However, fines varied on the severity of the crime and who the person was or what the person was, and the law of the land really. Viking civilizations didn't exactly have a written law and would differ from different lands. All I know is that in Skyrim, which is loosely based on that of Scandinavian folklore and Norse mythology, that when I get fined for committing a crime that I only did because I pushed the wrong button, I promise it was an accident, I immediately pay the fine and pickpocket it back. It's not so bad. You pay a fine, you get away. It's not so bad. Number 8. Banishment. "Hey, look over there, it's Skorgamor," said Ulfric, or someone of another Norse-like name like that. Don't worry, Norse sounds confusing to me too. What's not confusing, however, and very straightforward, but still pretty harsh, is banishment. If someone was found guilty enough of a crime, they could be banished from the village, and in time of wild beast disease and, well, other Vikings eyeing your village the same way flies look at cow manure, it was dangerous to be alone for that extended period of time. So some people were forbidden to come back into town and don the name Skorgamor. We'll go with that. Good luck in the winter, that's all I have to say. That's a tough life. Number 7. Outlawed. This one is kind of interesting. So oftentimes when choosing the punishment for a criminal, it came down to fines, banishment, and outlawing, and a lot of times all three. Outlawing went hand in hand with banishment. In a nutshell, it means you are no longer protected upon the laws of the land. So, should someone maybe want a little revenge, there's not much you can do. Should have committed that crime there, cowboy. Like I said before, this was oftentimes done to those who were banished, so not only were they tossed out of the village, but also not protected by the village anymore. Pretty much leaving the criminal to nature and whatever she has to offer. And we all know Mother Nature, she can be a little rough sometimes. Whew. Number 6. Rodeo. If you're gonna be dumb, you gotta be tough. This world is rough, if a man's gotta make it, he's gotta be tough. Wise words from a trailer park supervisor. Huh? This one is just crazy, stupid, and violent, so strap in, folks. There was a trial, or a way of passage, if you want to call it that involved Grease, a cow, and a criminal. You take the angriest cow in your herd, and you grease its tail up like a fat dude whose thighs have been chafing all day at a water park. The crook's hands would also be greased up. The cow was given a not too PETA-friendly poke from a farm tool, and the idea was while the cow was rightfully mad, kicking, stomping, and mooing, the crook would have to hang on for as long as possible. If he did and didn't let go, then there was no charges. If he did fall off and slip and let go, then, well, so long von Schlurgenbergen, Foreman or Ulfric. That's a Swedish name or something, I think. I don't know.
Number 5. Hijikata Toshizo. Back to the Shinsengumi. Hijikata joined the Shinsengumi alongside Kondo, where he rose his way to the title of Vice Commander. He was famed for rooting out corruption within his organization, and his dedication to the role was so great that he refused marriage on the pretense of how dangerous it would be for his wife. Keeping the group in line, they would join the Boshin War. During Kondo's capture, Hijikata would attempt to appeal Kondo's innocence, but was repeatedly denied. Fearing the collapse of the Tokugawa, Hijikata led one final raid to steal the warship Kotetsu, where the swordsmen were repelled by the ship's crew and a Gatling gun. Driven to Hakodate before the closing of the war, he instructed his page to dedicate a poem of his death. Though my body may decay on the island of Ezo, my spirit guards my lord in the east. He was later killed, shot while riding on horseback. The Shinsengumi surrendered and was disbanded. Number 4. Tomoe Gozen. Another warrior active during the late Heian period, Tomoe was one of Japanese history's few women warriors. She served under Yoshinaka, leading 300 samurai to victory against 200 Taira warriors in 1182. Clashing with Yoritomo, they lost the battle, Yoshinaka sending Tomoe away while claiming that he'd be ashamed to die with a woman. Smooth. From there, accounts and details become muddy. Apparently she just went on a rampage, killing at least 3 major samurai before escaping. One story goes that she was captured and made to wed the soldier Wada Yoshimori, and after his death in 1213, she made her way to a temple and became a monk, living until 91. Other stories claim that she committed seppuku, and more stories yet claim that she took her lord's head, walking into the sea with it to serve him in the afterlife. Any of these could be true, and personally I think the last one is really metal, so that'd be my headcanon. Number 3. Toyotomi Hideyoshi. We're getting into the big boys here. Originally beginning his career under Nobunaga, Hideyoshi would avenge his lord and assume authority. Constructing Osaka Castle, Hideyoshi would then engage in a series of campaigns against the Katsui and Ieyasu clans, creating the clan of Toyotomi. From there, he would campaign in an attempt to unify Japan, conquering Nagoroji, Shikoku, Toyama, Kyushu, and Odawara, which ended the Sengoku period. He'd also ban the peasantry from owning weapons to prevent revolts, creating a statue of Buddha from the melted remnants. He would then attempt to campaign against Korea with pretty poor results. One of his more famous acts was the perpetration of the 26 Martyrs, where 26 Christians were arrested and tortured, then crucified in Nagasaki. He'd tried a war with Korea again and would achieve some victories, but it would ultimately fail. Hideyoshi passed away in 1598. This would mark the beginning of Tokugawa's prohibition of expansionist attempts until the 19th century. Number 2. Oda Nobunaga. The biggest and baddest of the boys. Oda Nobunaga was born into power, but once his father passed, the clan began to dissolve into a succession crisis. He would wrangle power from his relatives, consolidating the clan in not a moment too soon, as their longtime rival Imagawa was ready to invade. Leading an army of roughly 2,000 men against 25,000, Nobunaga aggressively battled his rivals, gaining allies and territory through frankly genius strategic calls that led the small territory to sudden and crushing victories. He would then lead a campaign to unify Japan, a massive series of wars that began the Sengoku period. His exploits are far too many for just this one point, and in 1882 he would be betrayed by Akechi Mitsuhide, who would then take the life of Nobunaga's son and force Nobunaga to commit seppuku. Number 1. Miyamoto Musashi. Swordsman, philosopher, writer, ronin. These and many more titles are attributed to the famed warrior Miyamoto Musashi, the wandering swordsman whose exploits are detailed in the self-published Book of the Five Rings. The legends and exploits of this man are legendary, from his first duel to his fight with Sasaki Kojiro, and once more, what is fact and what is fiction can be heavily debated. He was also famed for his peculiar style of combat, using one sword in each hand, a katana and a wakizashi, or sometimes a jute, a sword parrying tool. He claimed that his arms could move more naturally that way, but it also just could have been the rule of cool. Musashi's greatest achievement may have simply just been passing away peacefully in his 60s. His fame has long since lasted in media, most famous being the manga series Vagabond.
At number 10, non-stop party. What is the longest amount of time you've gone out to party? A couple hours, maybe a weekend? Well, I don't think it could ever compare to how long the Vikings partied. The Vikings would have probably had a good old chuckle if they knew our parties only lasted a few hours. They'd be like, ha, look at these weaklings. Anyway, these guys could probably out-party anyone. Their biggest festivities, like the ones held after large expeditions or for weddings, would typically last for days days, but their major feasts like the ones they would use to celebrate the winter solstice may have lasted upwards of 12 days. Now that's a lot of party stamina. I would probably need about 50 Red Bulls to even try and keep up with these Vikings.
Number 9, actual really good food. Like pretty decent food. If you're a foodie, then I do have some good news for you. The Vikings were apparently like pretty decent cooks. For the time anyways. They stocked their parties with roasted meats like poultry, horse, and beef, with platters of greens, fruits, and buttered vegetables. Beer, ale, mead, and fruit wines were the common beverages, and heavy drinking was encouraged. Not unlike bars today, where there's always that one person who keeps secretly buying tequila shots for everybody, and then you're like, okay fine, I'll take it because I don't want to be rude, you know what I mean? Anyways, considering the fact that parties would sometimes last for weeks on end, having a lot of food in their party hut was super important. They needed enough to last them until the partying was done, which who knows when that would be.
At number 8, rap battles. Every party has to have some kind of activity, right? I mean, yeah, we can all stand around listening to music and kikiing it up, but it's way more fun to have activities to participate in, right? Well, the Vikings certainly knew how to throw a party because they had their collection of party activities to choose from, and it sounded kind of like a hoot and a half until we get to the other parts of this list and, you know, just throw that out the window. They would set up games like dice and chess, or at least their early Viking version of chess, and even board games. The Vikings also had this super fun drinking game called flighting, where partygoers would team up and recite poetry. They would drop some sick bars about their conquests and exploits, and would even drop a diss or two at their opponents, like a Drake versus Kanye moment. Oh, wait, no, they're friends now. Damn. Well, scratch that last part, but you know what I mean. On top of rap battles and board games, Viking parties just wouldn't be a proper event without drinking, and they even played a game to see who could drink the most. Honestly, I kind of feel bad for the Vikings' livers after all that, and imagine that hangover. Yikes.
Number 7, vicious tunes. Ever had a neighbor who would decide to throw a banger on like a weekday? Or have a roommate who thinks they're really good at guitar and wants to like prove it 24/7? They're like, wow, at like 4 AM? Yeah, it sucks. If you don't enjoy scenarios similar to this, then you would not want to live next door to a Viking encampment. These folks rocked out really hard and for, as we know, a long period of time. They loved live music, as do I, and archaeologists have recovered flutes, hornpipes, and stringed instruments from settlements. But as most of the singers were well into the mead, according to Arab travelers, they weren't easy on the ears. Like, picture the moment Bohemian Rhapsody comes on in a bar and the screeches sounds everyone makes as they try to say Galileo like really loud. My voice is dead. That would be awful. One account described their singing comparable to the calls of wild animals. Oh, poor, that's rough. But sometimes they would switch it up with some poetry, as mentioned, by skilled artists called skalds.
At number 6, full send or no send. It seems like the Vikings lived by the notion full send or no send because, man, the things get wild and crazy at their parties. There was no holding back with these guys. Oh no. I know I previously mentioned some of the activities that the Vikings would have at their parties, but those ones were the tame ones, and if you know the Vikings, they can't have PG-friendly shindigs. Of course not. There's gotta be scenes of violence and coarse language. Viewer discretion is advised. Other than playing chess and having rap battles, they also had mass casualties. They played games where people literally kicked the bucket, but I guess dying at a party this wild is a good enough way to go. Some of their more dangerous party activities included throwing leftover bones at one another with the deliberate intent of inflicting bodily harm. They also played a full contact bat and ball game that would often end in injury, or the big sleep. And they also held a swimming contest. But there wasn't that much actual swimming involved, since the point of the game was to hold their opponent underwater for as long as possible. I would have to imagine that these so-called games would just make for a vicious cycle, because they'd celebrate something, play these games, kill someone, and then the funeral will have them celebrating again, just to do it all over again. What a wild life these Vikings lived.
Number 5. Lozen. Lozen was a Chichihene Chiricahua Apache combatant who fought for the freedom of her people from the San Carlos Reserve in Arizona. Operating under the command of her brother Victorio, Lozen was famed for leading refugees across the Rio Grande and guiding a mother and child across the Chihuahuan Desert, supposedly even taking down a longhorn with just a knife to silently acquire supplies. Returning to the front, Lozen was eventually captured, passing away as a prisoner of war, but her tale lives on as a legendary warrior. Number 4. Boudica. Upon the death of Iceni king Prasutagus, he issued a will that proclaimed both of his daughters and the Emperor Nero to be his heirs. His will was ignored by the Romans, and the kingdom was subsumed by the Britannian province, Roman soldiers sent to ensure its delivery into Nero's hands. What happened from there was an utterly vile razing of Iceni lands. Prasutagus' wife Boudica and his daughters were tortured and their people massacred. Boudica, incensed with the desperation of revenge, organized an uprising and led an army of Iceni warriors to regain their liberty. They responded to the brutalities committed against them in kind, ensuring that even if they did not win, then the Romans would at least understand the grave error they'd made in taking their land. Number 3. Fu Hao. One of the strongest generals in Chinese history, Fu Hao worked as both a priest and a warrior. She married into Wu Jing's household and worked her way up the ranks, making her way to the position of second queen. From there, she engaged in military activities and rituals, overseeing numerous campaigns in the name of the Shang dynasty. She is also credited with the earliest known usage of the ambush tactic in Chinese history. While exceptional from current knowledge of this period, it should be noted that the Shang dynasty frequently employed women as soldiers within their armies. Even so, her achievements were so great that on her passing, Fu Hao was buried with 130 weapons, along with several human sacrifices and a massive amount of jade and other assorted objects. Number 2. Zenobia. One of the greatest Syrian rulers, Septima Zenobia rose to power through marrying King Odenathus, who was assassinated by the jealous Maeonius, who lasted as emperor for all of about 5 minutes before being killed by his own soldiers. Though her son was set to rule, he was also, 10, so Zenobia was made the regent. Consolidating power, Zenobia began to expand her borders eastward, her regency slowly turning into just plain out old rule. Declaring her son to be the emperor, she became the de facto empress, and continued to rule. Beloved by her people, she made the kingdom a place of learning and religious tolerance, striving to make sure that the multiple peoples under her rule were treated fairly and well. While she initially attempted to avoid conflict with Rome, they did clash after the whole, she became an empress thing. The result did end up in Zenobia's loss, and she was captured by the Romans, who apparently spared her. And accounts from what happened then are sketchy at best. We may not know what exactly happened, but the empire she made was certainly one to remember. Number 1. Ana Nzinga. Queen of the Mbundu kingdoms in the land of Angola, Nzinga initially began her career in politics as an ambassador to the Portuguese, whom the Mbundu were constantly at war with. When her father passed, her brother Mbandi came to power, attempting to consolidate his strength and continue warring with the Portuguese. He used his sister as a diplomat to attempt for peace. However, the Portuguese demeaned and belittled her, furnishing their rooms with chairs for themselves and a floor mat for her. Undaunted, Nzinga had her attendant form her chair and spoke with the diplomats eye to eye, securing a peace treaty. This was short-lived, however, and Mbandi eventually had to abdicate the throne to her. From there, she led a war against the Portuguese and the Mbangalans, taking the Matamba lands and growing her forces through a mixture of carefully plotted and ingenious exploitations of cultural rules and rights. She warred with Portugal for 25 years, wearing down their forces until peace talks began, aided by the Portuguese stirring conflict with Spain. Nzinga would then begin to tentatively integrate Christianity into her kingdom, and strove to ensure that no wars of succession would occur after her passing.
At number 10, marriages. If there's anything we've learned on this channel after talking about marriages so many times, it's that marriages long ago were rarely for love, and this still goes for the samurai. After the samurai really started to flourish during the Edo period, they became some of the highest ranked people in Japanese society. As we've learned before on this channel, when you are a person of high status, your marriages become more of a political or financial bargain than anything else, and these marriages were usually arranged. This meant that a lot of samurai were involved in arranged marriages so as to boost the statuses of other families. As you can imagine, this rarely went over well with the people who were actually being forced to marry, as many of them would have already fallen in love with other people prior to this arrangement. This unfortunately led to a lot of couples to take their own lives rather than marry other people, which is quite Shakespearean when you come to think about it. It was a messed up system, but when it comes to status, people would do anything to make their families more respected, even at the cost of other people's happiness. At number 9, weapon testing. The katana. Everyone knows it. This was the most famous weapon used by the samurai, and as it was an important weapon, they had to be tested before being put in the hands of Japan's most famous warriors. The elaborate testing that these katanas were put through was called tameshigiri, which translates to test cut in English. This process would have the sword's owner cut through different materials like bamboo, wood, or armor, but there was a darker side to these tests too. The gruesome subsection to tameshigiri testing was called sumonogiri, which translates to the cutting of tied objects. Now you would think, oh, these tied objects were just things like bamboo tied to a tree or something. But no, the tied objects were dead bodies. Yeah, katanas were being tested on dead people. The bodies that were normally used for these weapons testing were usually those of dead criminals, but that doesn't make it any less terrifying. It makes you think twice about how these swords got their bloody stamp of approval, especially as sometimes the amount of bodies that the sword cut through would be inscribed on the side of the blade. Creepy. Now before we carry on talking about the messed up things that the samurai did, why not take a moment to leave a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and while you're at it, maybe consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one. At number 8, poverty. When one thinks of a samurai warrior, you don't really think of them as impoverished. I mean, at one point they were seen as members of high society, but there also came a time that the samurai started to see money as, quote, too tainted to mess with, so they made a conscious effort to avoid it. After the Tokugawa shoguns of the Edo period felt having warm clothing and plenty of food would be detrimental to society, the samurai took this to heart and began living lives of poverty. This has been widely believed because people have grown accustomed to believing in the idea of the noble, humble, and honorable samurai, but historians believe that these impoverished samurai could have been influenced by a number of reasons, like their status in society and having things change too quickly for them. Psychological poverty seems to be one of the running theories as to why the samurai started living lives of squalor, because they had grown accustomed to their wealth and power, that their expectations of such rose higher than their actual income. At number 7, wakashudo. As it turns out, the samurai were surprisingly open-minded about same-sex marriage. However, on the flip side, there was a darker side to their same-sex pairings. Back in the days of the samurai, there was a tradition called wakashudo, where younger men were required to pair up with older samurai. They would essentially become something of a combination of trainees as well as field wives for an older samurai. In return, the older man would be a mentor to his young companion. He would train him and protect his companion until his apprenticeship was completed, where the young man would then move up in ranks. This sounds like it could have been effective in theory, however the practice of wakashudo wasn't exactly voluntary. Young warriors were expected to follow in this tradition, and it was believed that if a handsome young man didn't yield to his older lover, then he would be acting shamefully, and this shame would follow him into the next life, resulting him in being disfigured and weak. These young men were being coaxed into this through fear, which is pretty messed up if you ask me. At number 6, ruthless. This next fact about the samurai is certainly one of the most terrifying, so brace yourselves, bumblebees. One of the most messed up traditions of the samurai was something called sushigiri, which when translated means roadside killings, and it's pretty much as straightforward as the name gets. This practice has its roots in honorable duelings, but later became much darker and evolved into a practice where samurai would sneak around to unexpectedly slash at passing merchants and peasants. What makes this a little more sick and twisted is the excuses that some samurai would give in order to justify their actions. Some would claim that they were simply looking to test their weapon, or they were practicing a new strike, while others would claim that they just felt like attacking someone. Talk about messed up, right? To make things even darker though, there was even a legend floating around at the time that claimed that 1,000 sushigiri killings could cure an illness. Sushigiri became such a prevalent issue that it became banned in 1602, but even then it didn't just stop overnight and instead just fizzled out over time, meaning that peasants and merchants were never truly safe from these samurai sneak attacks. At number 5, building fires. The Vikings were some pretty innovative people, but they were also kinda gross. This gross behavior applied to a lot of things, but one of those things was their fire building. Now you're probably asking yourself, Bree, what's so gross about making a fire? Well, it's the way that they started the fire that was kinda grody. You see, nowadays we have a bunch of things that we can use to start a fire. We have matches, lighters, lighter fluid, and a bunch of other things. But obviously back in the days of the Vikings, they didn't have those fire starting tools, and so they had to improvise. The Vikings came up with a nifty little trick to start a fire where they took a fungus called touchwood and they would beat it and burn it until it turned into a thin, flat thing that kinda looked like felt. Then they decided to get gross and would then boil the touchwood in human urine because urine contained sodium nitrate, which would help the touchwood turn into something that would smolder rather than burn. They could then take this stuff with them and use it to start fires whenever they wanted so they could cook food over their urine-fueled fire. Sounds delightful. And number 4, conning. Conning people has been something that's kind of been part of many societies since probably the dawn of civilization. Anyone can con anyone into doing anything or buying anything. I mean, people do it on eBay all the time. But apparently, the Vikings were also known to con people probably for their own enjoyment, because they're Vikings. Back in the day, the Vikings would do trades with the Inuit people and they would acquire narwhal tusks from them. The Vikings would then sell those tusks to other people, marketing them as unicorn horns, and let's face it, no one's gonna turn down buying a unicorn horn. Because of the Vikings and their conning ways, by the Middle Ages, people not only believed that unicorns were actually real, but that they also had magical powers. So in a way, if you were obsessed with unicorns as a kid, you can thank the Vikings for that. At number 3, house bears. Humans seem to be pretty good at domesticating animals. We domesticated dogs by accident and now they're considered man's best friend. We domesticated livestock for food and other purposes. We domesticated horses to be our transportation and carry things. So we kind of know our way around animals and could probably make anything into our pet if we really wanted to. But the Vikings weren't just satisfied with dogs, horses, and livestock. They were the mighty Vikings and they needed mighty pets, and that's why they kept bears as their companions. Yes, bears. Now don't get me wrong, the Vikings also had normal pets like dogs and cats, and they would even sometimes bring them along on their expeditions, but they also really liked bears. It is said that when they weren't out laying siege to someone's town or sailing the seas, the Vikings would visit bear dens and take bear cubs home with them. They would then raise the cubs as house bears. But having a house bear was also a very big responsibility. You had to make sure that your bear was kept in check at all times, so that meant no eating people or livestock, no disturbing your neighbors, and if your bear did get into trouble, you would either get hit with a fine or be banned from having a house bear. So maybe it's best to stick with normal pets like dogs. At number 2, worthy kids. The Vikings were ruthless even when it came to their spawn. I mean their kids. These guys were really picky when it came to having a family because they weren't afraid to just yeet their kids if they didn't like them enough. Back in their day, when a baby was born, they would christen their kid with a name during a ceremony called Osavatni, but only after determining if this kid was even worth raising in the first place. You see, when a baby was delivered, the child would be placed on the ground for the father to then pick up and examine. He would be looking for any physical deformities, disabilities, and to determine if the kid was actually his or not. He would decide if the kid had a future. If they did, then they would hold the Osavatni ceremony where water was sprinkled on the kid's head and given a name, and if they weren't worthy, then they would be left outside in the elements and abandoned. And finally, at number 1, criminal profiling. It turns out that the Vikings kind of invented criminal profiling. You see, when the Viking horde would set off to battle, there was no telling how they would return. You have to remember that these guys were bloodthirsty and violent, and there was no telling what was going on in their heads. I mean, don't even get me started on the whole berserker rage thing because that itself is very intense. But basically, when the horde would return home, they seemed to have caused a lot of problems because many of them couldn't turn off their rage and would just wreak havoc on the town. To deal with this, it is said that a series of Icelandic sagas were written as a sort of profile to warn the homegrown Vikings of what to look out for when the others would return. They had to kind of alter their stories a little bit because if they were too specific, then it would have caused people to learn to be afraid of basically any Viking man, so they had to keep things a little generic, but for the most part, people learned to stay away from those who couldn't turn off the berserker rage at home in order to keep themselves and the rest of their community safe.
And we're kicking off this list with blot. These were blood sacrifices that were performed in order to appease the gods. Luckily, blot often refers to sacrifices of animals rather than human beings. It was often horses or pigs that were used, but the size of the animal was in direct correlation with the level of gratitude they were showing towards the gods. The animals were placed over stone altars before being sacrificed, and their blood was collected in a bowl that would get passed around, and with each person they would, take a sip of the bowl. Sometimes twigs were even dipped into the bowls of blood and then shaken around at onlookers, spraying them with droplets of blood, kind of like a Jackson Pollock painting is what I picture. The meat of the animal was also doused in its own blood before being feasted on. This was a really common practice. It would take place all throughout the year, but now let's move on to a more special Viking tradition. Next up, we have Viking Yule. The Viking Yule festival sounds pretty pleasant. Some of our modern Christmas traditions were inspired by Yule. They'd feast, burn the Yule log, there was a Yule tree, again very Christmas reminiscent. They drank heavily, sounds like Christmas to me. There was one tradition though that's thankfully been left out of our modern holiday celebrations: human sacrifice. Yes, every 9th year during Yule, there would be a total of 81 human sacrifices spanning over 9 days. So that's 9 human sacrifices a day. Yes, kings would sacrifice 9 men per day, with their heads being offered to the gods. What a way to ring in the holiday season. Happy Yule, Sven. By the way, cancel all your plans because the king just told me you're getting your head cut off this afternoon. This isn't even, really all that strange. Human sacrifice has been present all throughout human history, all over the world, really. It's just kind of funny thinking about how celebratory it was here. Not something that's easy for us modern people to wrap our heads around. The various methods Vikings would use to ward off the Draugr. First off, what is a Draugr? They're basically undead warriors. Zombie Vikings. Yeah, zombies. Scary enough as it is. Imagine facing off against an undead Viking. They were depicted having superhuman strength, they smelt of death and had a ghastly appearance. They would also often be, depicted as blue or like dark, with decay. If you've ever seen the Northmen, you may be familiar with the Draugr. We get this awesome fight with one of them. Very cool creatures in Viking folklore. So Vikings, being as superstitious as they were, sought to prevent the recently deceased from becoming one of these undead entities, and there were several methods they would employ. They would sometimes place a pair of scissors on the chest of the corpse. They'd hide twigs in their clothing, or they would drive needles into the bottom of their feet to keep the dead from walking around again. That one makes sense. That's a pretty practical one. They would abandon children deemed sickly or weak. This isn't much of a surprise given that Viking culture was so heavily centered on strength. Vikings were a warrior culture, constantly engaged in battle, so children that were too small or sick were just really of no use. The most common method of ridding themselves of the weak was to just chuck them into the sea or take them deep into the forest where they'd be left to fend for themselves, often freezing to death or becoming a wolf pack's next meal. They didn't just do this in order to maintain a strong society though. Vikings also lived in a very harsh climate where, those that were unable to contribute were just really extra mouths to feed. They were a bit of a burden. So yeah. Different times. This is also a practice not unique to Vikings though. Another famous group of warriors, the Spartans, dispose of unhealthy children. So yeah, I'm glad we live in 2023. Vikings actually dyed their hair. Yes, as it turns out, that classic image a lot of us have of Vikings in our minds is having long blonde hair and beards. It's not just a myth. I guess, nobody ever thought the blonde hair thing was a myth necessarily. Many Nordic people have blonde hair, of course, but that super extra blonde look really was a thing. The beauty standards in Viking culture called for blonde hair. So for those that didn't have it naturally or just wanted to get it extra blonde, they would have, they would actually use a specific type of soap that was heavily concentrated and contained high amounts of lye, which we still use today to make stuff like glass cleaner and fertilizer, actually. This would basically strip their hair of its natural color. They were basically kind of like bleaching their hair. hair, really. They'd also do the same things to their beards, which, oh my god, I can only imagine how dried out that would have made them. Beards, I mean, you gotta moisturize these things, you know? The hair is very different. I bleached my hair before and it gets super stiff. It's almost like hay at first, so they must have had some extra crispy beards.
Number 5, meat hook. Sometimes when given fines, it wasn't always cash value that was taken. Sometimes if the crime was heinous enough, the evildoer's property and items were taken instead. Well, sometimes folks didn't like having their stuff taken, which makes sense, they put up a fuss. No one likes their stuff getting taken. Just ask George Carlin, he knows a lot about that stuff. Everybody loves their stuff. In order for authorities to take possessions from the convicted, they would slice their ankles open, which, just talking about that makes me sick. And then for good measure, tie them up and suspend them from the ceiling from a beam in their house. No, not unaliving them, keeping them very alive, just severely hindering their movement and ability to say, hey, get your hands off my limited edition Obi-Wan Kenobi Lego set. That one's mine. Number 4, tree hugger. I hope you folks at home aren't eating during this video. It's about to get a little Mortal Kombat in here, if you will. Even though I watch videos when I eat. Carpet cleaning videos, anyone? Where's my lunch? You know what I mean? I do weird things like that. I don't know. The second most horrible sentence the Vikings could bestow upon their criminals and dredges of their society involved a tree. I'll get to the first one later, it's pretty heinous. It involved a tree, a knife, and a squishy rope. Squishy rope? What? Yeah, I'll get to that. Trees being great symbols of Norse mythology and culture, it made sense to do this here. Shout out to Yggdrasil. Oh, cool stuff. You take your perpetrator and you carve open his belly like a high school jack-o'-lantern contest, and you pull his intestines out, and you keep pulling them out till you've got enough to wrap around the tree. And you basically tie him there. Except you don't wrap him around the tree, he walks himself around the tree until he's out of string, like a sick yo-yo. Oh, gross. This was extremely painful and not quick at all, as humans can live for a couple hours without their squishy rope inside their belly. Not to mention it probably attracted wild animals for a quick and easy meal. Not a good way to go. Don't recommend that. That's sick. That's twisted. Number 3, drowning. Given the naval status of the Scandinavian nations at the time, it makes sense that they use water. It's simple, it's cheap, effective, and there's a lot of it. When a serious enough crime was committed, sometimes people were drowned, or in later terms they ran out of oxygen underwater, tried to breathe underwater, overpowered by the tide, or was left unattended by the city swimming pool, if you catch my drift. Number 2, trial by fire. There's water, now there's fire, of course. Well, if cold water was too much for you, then this should warm you up. Trial by fire was more of a punishment, and less of a lethal one, if you will. If you survived the ordeal, that meant God was on your side. Thus, they couldn't be guilty, because yeah, that totally works. The trial by fire included a couple different heat-based trials. No amount of red potion or Goron's tunic would get you through this. There was one version that saw people dip their hands in boiling water or oil, which right there, you ever seen those like Wimmis commercials where anyway. Walking across hot coals, which can be proven to be done without getting hurt. I saw it on Mythbusters once, so if it's on Mythbusters, that's just truth, folks, come on. Lastly, the one thing that I think is the worst is holding a hot stone or iron for a determined period of time. Yes, how long do you think you could hold onto a red hot iron? I'd say not long. Even with seconds of exposure, you would have close to 3rd-degree burns, probably 3rd-degree burns on the palm of your hands, and long before polysporin, painkillers, and toilet paper. Not a good combo. Don't you have a burnt hand, you go to do that, you know? Ooh, that's not gonna be good. You're gonna get a little sick. Number 1, this is the worst one on the list, the Blood Eagle. The Vikings were very creative, to say the least. I just had to include this one, it's awful. And in the style of Mortal Kombat, of course, you take a crook, you take his back, and you rip his rib cage out of his back. It was cut out from the chest and positioned in such a way that it looked like an eagle with its wings flying, just, you know, with a lot of blood, hence the Blood Eagle. After that amount of carnage, you would bleed out and experience excruciating pain. Not as common as other things on this list, it was saved for the worst of the worst, but yeah, it is the worst. No thank you.
Number 10. Weddings. When we look back on history, the traditions of marriages generally stand out as unique ways to peer into the lives of ancient civilizations. With the Vikings, marriages were generally done as ways to join houses through blood ties, which were rarely romantic. Traditionally held on Friday, the day of Freya, goddess of fertility, the couple was separated to go through separate rituals. The bride would take a bath and also remove the kronsen, which symbolized her status as a woman who was unwed, and store it for her future daughter. The groom would then go and break into his ancestor's tomb and steal their stuff, usually their swords. During the ceremony, rings and family swords would be exchanged, and a feast would be had in their honor. During this, one tradition was to stab their swords into a pillar. The deeper the sword went, the better their marriage would be and the more children they'd have. Number 9. Teeth painting. When exhuming the many skeletons of Vikings that have passed throughout history, a remarkable detail was found throughout all of them. Notches of varying size, depth, and length were found to have been cut into the teeth of these ancient warriors. The reason for their existence was something of a mystery. Furthermore, comparing the style to historical Vikings, the name of the Danish king Harald Bluetooth suggests that his title may have been slightly more literal than initially thought. This would have been achieved through the application of a mixture of resins and dyes, though whether or not it was permanent would be hard to know for sure, since the evidence has long since rotted away. Number 8. Blonde hair. The image of the Viking as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed warrior is prolific and also wrong. While the majority of Vikings were observed to be blonde and described as such, this was actually due to an extremely early application of hair dye. That being said, this wasn't solely due to fashion, though blonde hair was considerably valued in Viking society. The method in which Vikings dyed their hair was through the use of lye, which contains potassium. Potassium can often strip the pigmentation off of hair, and if Vikings washed frequently, which they actually did, they were weirdly hygienic, then it would lead to their hair gradually being dyed blonde. A side effect of this was that lye was also extremely toxic to lice, which helped prevent outbreaks on ships. Number 7. Torches. Moving straight from hygiene to whatever this is. Starting a fire is extremely hard. You'll see two guys rubbing sticks together in the movies and suddenly fire appears, but you know what? That doesn't work at all. The conditions for friction alone being enough to start a fire have to be absolutely perfect. The right temperature, the right humidity, the dryness, all of it. So this is why people decided to find other methods for starting fires, such as flint, a material that is fairly easy to find wherever you go. But with flint, you also need tinder, and this is where it gets a little weird. It always gets weird with tinder. The Vikings had a particular species of mushroom that they'd use for their torches, which they would carefully prepare and then boil in their own urine. Well, because, and it's honestly more likely that they found this out through trial and error, they probably didn't actually know the chemicals and all this, urine contains sodium nitrate, which burns real good, as it's a chemical neighbor of potassium nitrate, which is found in gunpowder. This was actually a fairly common technique for creating torches at the time, and, you know, just really cool. If not, like, you know, really weird. Number 6. The 81 Yule offerings. Christmas is coming, and if you're a Viking, that usually isn't a great thing. Not because of the Norse gods or anything, Vikings were actually pretty quick to pick up Christianity, but more because Christmas was the time where a pretty brutal ritual would take place. Specifically referred to as Yule, the ritual was estimated to have been in honor of family members that had passed away, and generally involved singing, dancing, and killing 81 men to offer their heads to the gods. Merry Christmas!
Number 5, drunk sword fighting and other things. Imagine letting a 2-year-old hold a very sharp broadsword. Sounds like a bad idea, right? Well, nobody seemed to think so when they put swords in the hands of drunk Vikings, which, let's be honest, that's pretty much what a 2-year-old is essentially like a drunk person walking around. Outdoors, Vikings constantly wanted to one-up each other on the strength meter. They had weightlifting competitions, who could lift the heaviest stones, they wrestled, held archery contests, and of course sword fighting competitions, as well as all the games Bree mentioned above. Were they sober? Probably not. They also had a game called Togo Honk, which was kind of like tug of war. Men would sit on the ground facing one another, press their feet together and bend their knees. The goal was to try to straighten your opponent's legs and flip him over. Honestly, that sounds like a blast. Do you think it's a smart idea to put a sword in a drunk guy's hand? No, but it was the Viking era. There were literally no rules except for a few.
At number 4, not enough chairs. Now we know that these Viking celebrations would often last for days on end, right? So imagine if during all that time you couldn't sit anywhere comfortable. Sounds pretty unfortunate, but it was the reality of a lot of Viking parties. Because these gatherings were so big, hundreds of people would be in attendance, but unfortunately there wouldn't be enough space to sit. To try and accommodate their hundreds of guests, Vikings would break out their longest tables and benches, but usually this still wasn't enough space for everyone, so it became kind of a rule that only the most important people were allowed to sit. Chairs are thought to have been pretty rare, so the most powerful and wealthiest Vikings were allowed to sit in chairs. Everyone else had to fend for themselves, either sitting on uncomfortable benches or just standing around. Now doing this for a couple of hours? No problem. For a 2-week celebration, you can count me the heck out. If my tushy's not comfortable, I'm going home.
Number 3, fertility celebrations. So we talked a lot about what Vikings actually did back then and how they partied. They partied pretty hard. But now we're talking about what kind of festivals they had. This holiday is celebrated on April 30th in Finland, Sweden, and Germany, but goes all the way back to the Vikings. This night is called Walpurgis Night, or Valburgas Night, or I probably said it wrong, but let me know, and is named after a woman called Valborg. She was born in 710 somewhere in Dorset/Wessex as the niece of St. Boniface. She traveled with her brothers to Württemberg, Germany and became a nun. She lived in a convent of Heidenheim and became renowned for her healing powers and was canonized as a saint after she died. This celebration is in honor of her, however it was originally a pagan celebration called Beltane, a celebration of the return of summer. Viking fertility celebrations took place in and around April 30th, and due to Valborg claiming this date as well, the two celebrations became one and the same eventually. Viking fertility celebrations usually involved sacrificing an animal or two of some kind, and included all of the above.
At number 2, Harvest/Winter Night Celebration. Next up in celebrations to mark on your calendar, we have the Harvest/Winter Night that took place on October 31st. It can also be referred to as Elf Blessing, Disblessing, or Frey Blessing. Kind of like our spooky tradition today, it was a time of honoring the ancestral spirits, spirits of the land, the Vanir, along with the powers of fruitfulness, wisdom, and, of course, death. A little brutal, yet kind of merciful in a way, the animals who weren't going to be able to make it through the winter were smoked or made into sausage. It was often led by the women of the household. They left the last sheep in the field as an offering to Odin, though this varies. It also marks the start of something called the Wild Hunt. The roads and fields became territory of ghosts and trolls and marks the beginning of the darkest and coldest time of the year. The festivities and feasts are particularly joyous, and they mainly aim to celebrate kinship, accomplishments, and the tales of the year.
Last but not least, Yule! This last one is perfect for the season we are entering, and a great way to end the list. The festival of Yule was, kind of still is, a celebration of 12 days. It was the most important of all Norse holidays and began on the night of December 20th. The god Yngvi Freyr rides over the earth on the back of his shining boar, bringing light and love back into the world. Later, Christianity influenced things, changing the god to Baldur, then Jesus, who's said to be reborn at the festival. For the Vikings, Yule signified the beginning and end of all things, taking place at the darkest time of the year. Children were said to leave their boots outside filled with hay and sugar for the god's journey, and in return they would receive a little present. Sound familiar? On top of that, the celebration would include drinking, feasting, songs, games, banquets, and sacrifices to the gods and the ancestor spirits for the 12 days. They even had what was called a Yule tree, which inspired the use of the Christmas tree today.
Let's start at the beginning, how gladiators got going. The notion of gladiators originated with the Etruscans, who preceded the Romans in central Italy. Traditionally, when an Etruscan leader died, as part of the funeral ceremony, a pair of warriors, sometimes, fought to the death with their bare hands to honor his warlike spirit. Normal stuff. But over time this practice becomes institutionalized, and the Romans subsequently imitate it in a more digestible way to them, while simultaneously distancing themselves from the savagery of the Etruscans. Throughout the next 800 years of the Roman Republic, gladiator games remained infrequent on a small scale and only held as part of a funeral service for those of high rank. That practice began to change in the late Republic. Julius Caesar put on a gladiatorial show that featured 320 pairs of gladiators in honor of his father, who'd already been dead for 20 years. Seems like nobody important died recently, and Julius really had a hankering for a gore show. From then on, the gladiator games thrown by him made the younger Caesar popular with the people of Rome. One notable exhibition took place in 216 BC, when 22 fights were held over 3 days to mark the death of a prominent senator. From boo-hoo to yahoo, tradition to entertainment. In ancient Rome, it was tradition for the state to provide entertainment using two categories: lude, meaning theatrical performances, dances, and chariot races and other creative pursuits. Then there's monera, or spectacles, such as wild animal shows, death sentences, and other unusual exhibitions. The Romans' concept of entertainment was that most of these events had a religious component, held on religious days, accompanied by prayers and sacrifices, a way of paying homage to the gods. As mentioned, gladiators started out as a weird funerary rite, and Julius segues them into the everyday by having a big melee, so now boom, they're suddenly part of Monera. There is scholarly debate if this is truly from public demand alone, or if the gladiatorial games being used as distractions that kept the people subdued, so they were just hardcore promoted in the village. Some argued that the game reflected the typical Roman virtues such as courage, endurance, and martial skill, while others, like Roman satirist Juvenal, thought that the games preyed on the Roman unhealthy obsessions with bread and circuses, aka blood sport. In Rome, death sentences and ritual killings were a way of keeping the peace and showing the Romans who boss was. The arena was the next step, an advancement in societal distraction used to entertain the lower class citizens of Rome, but at the same time uniting them together in an uphold of societal rules. Think this is horrific? May I turn your attention to rugby, hockey, and basketball, three sports notorious for hardcore hits and the spilling of blood. Think of audience reaction when a fight breaks out, when a tooth goes flying, when someone lands a dirty hit. Yeah, not so archaic, is it? Thank God though, because it all came at the price of celebrity status. And yeah, it's still a price if your social rank remains that of a gutter rat. Your reminder that gladiators, no matter how esteemed, were lumped into the social ladder with working girls and heretics. Though often dismissed as uncivilized brutes by Roman historians and aristocracy, traditionally the gladiators won massive fame amongst the lower classes. So much that a name was coined for their ancient fangirl gaggles, ludiae, or training school girls, coined by Juvenal once again. Gladiator portraits graced the walls of many public places. Children played with gladiator action figures made of clay, and the most successful of fighters even endorsed products like today's app. Many women wore jewelry glazed in their blood and mixed some of their sweat into some of their cosmetics. I'll dare any one of you guys watching to walk onto an NBA court and try and get some LeBron sweat for your next face mask. We know that gladiators were private citizens with a life sentence, people overwhelmed by debt, criminals, and occasionally free men attracted to the arena by promises of riches and honors. They never lost their community connections though when becoming a gladiator, and those who managed to make a killing at it, pun intended, have been documented to heavily give back to communities they came from, free enslaved individuals, and support the economy. One of the ways they could do that was brotherhoods, because anyone who wasn't nobility had a pretty good sense as to what the Roman day-to-day was like, so they knew if everyone was already against them, their class, and had no intention to raise them above said stereotype, then howdy doody, they'll just support their own lives and economies while the royal ladies fetishize them and the royal kids admire them. Yes, regularly they would be throwing down in life or death combat against one another, but gladiators viewed themselves as a kind of brotherhood and often took it upon themselves to organize into collegia with their own elected leaders and chosen protector deity from the wide pantheon of available gods. When a warrior fell in battle, these groups would ensure that their comrade received a proper funeral and grave inscription honoring his achievements in the arena. The same can be said for grievous injuries. Pooled union money could go towards a surgery or recovery or medicine of dire need. If the deceased had a wife or children, they would also see the family receive monetary compensation for their loss. This tradition protected their own, their community, and the fallen. And as you could guess, injuries and fatalities are pretty common in a battle of contrast. Gladiator battles had a lot of overlooked details and facets that don't bleed over into common conversation. You can have a whole conversation about what gladiators would wear while duking it out with his enemies without understanding why. It goes back to one word: tradition. Shocking, seeing as it's literally in the name of the video. The Romans liked a battle of contrast, matching a heavily armed and armored man against a lightly equipped and more barren opponent. It's supposed to be like some Tom Tom and Jerry, one big broody type throwing everything he can, including the monkey wrench, at the lighter, smaller man who runs in circles around him. I am essentially telling you that the Romans set up their death games similar to how we set up cartoons. Yeah, I am. Big plot device came from all this blood sport lunacy.
At number 5, wives. Now, after learning what we have so far, you can come to understand that the life of a samurai wasn't exactly sunshine and rainbows, right? Well, I'm about to tell you about people in the lives of samurai who arguably had it worse than the warriors. Being married to a samurai meant that there was a lot of honor to uphold, and that was a lot of pressure. As a result, there was an act that was performed by the wives of the samurai to uphold their honor of their husbands and their family. Some of you may be familiar with the practice of seppuku, and if not, we will get into that in a moment. But essentially, it was a method of taking your life in an honorable way. This practice was reserved for the samurai, but their wives had their own variation called jigai. This practice was focused on swiftness and dignity and would be performed for a number of reasons, from anointing from her family's shame to preserving her honor in the event of an enemy invasion. But most commonly though, jigai was performed by wives whose husbands performed seppuku, as samurai wives felt it necessary to end her life if her husband had done the same. The women would tie their knees together as to not be discovered in a compromising position, then she would slit her throat and end her life. At number 4, last stand. As we are no doubt familiar, in life all things must end, and such is the same with the samurai. Though they were the noble warriors of Japan for many dynasties, eventually things had to change. Towards the end of the 1800s, Japan was looking to enter more modern times, and with that they were disbanding the samurai clans. By 1877, only one clan remained, and they refused to go down without a fight, and a fight is exactly what they got. On September 25th, 1877, the government sent in 30,000 soldiers to fight the last samurai clan, but with only 500 men and limited supplies, they didn't really stand much of a chance. They knew that this would be their final battle, and so the night before the battle, they had one last sake party, and in the morning they stormed into battle. 3 hours into the fight, only 40 men were left alive. The samurai leader had been fatally wounded, and not too long after that, the remaining fighters were overtaken by the opposing force, thus ending the last samurai clan. At number 3, insults. In another installment of dumb reasons the samurai would randomly kill people, let's talk about the practice of killing people who insulted others. These days, if we feel as though we've been insulted by someone, usually a clapback is in order, but back in the days of the samurai, things were a little different and a lot bloodier. The samurai were allowed to practice something called kirisure gomen, which translates to authorization to cut and leave. Essentially, the samurai were given the authority to legally kill someone if they felt like they had been insulted or disrespected. The only fine print to this was that the killing had to happen immediately after they were disrespected, and the victim was a member of the lower class. The initial insult and subsequent retaliation by the samurai also had to have been witnessed by someone else who could back up the samurai story, but the samurai were allowed to use their own friends and servants as witnesses, which seems a little biased, but then again, we're talking about killing people because your feelings were mildly bruised. The only downside that this posed to the samurai is that if they were found guilty of misusing their authority to practice kirisure gomen, they would be given a severe punishment of beheading, and their house would be abolished, meaning that the samurai's son would not be able to inherit the title of samurai after their father's passing. At number 2, seppuku. Now remember I mentioned the practice of seppuku a little while ago? Well, let's talk about it. Seppuku was a ritualistic method of taking your own life, where a samurai would slice his stomach open with a small sword. This was seen as an honorable way to die on the battlefield and was established sometime during the 12th century. There were 2 variations on performing seppuku. One was slicing the abdomen vertically and horizontally, then the samurai would just bleed out and die an excruciating and drawn out death. Doesn't really sound too jazzy to me. But the other, and arguably less excruciating way, was for the samurai to perform a horizontal cut across his abdomen, then immediately following that, his comrade would decapitate him, ending his life instantly. Still a pretty horrific way to go, but at least it's a lot quicker than the other method, right? Outside of the battlefield though, when a samurai would prepare to take his own life, he would first write a death poem, have a couple shots of sake, and then perform the ritual. And finally, at number 1, for the streets. Now let's get to talking about what I think is probably the most bizarre and messed up thing that the samurai did. During a period of peace, the samurai didn't really have anything to do. I mean, they were warriors, but when there were no battles or wars to fight in, they kinda got bored. Their swords were just sitting there, gathering dust. So what did they do to fight their boredom? Well, they took to the streets, of course. A number of unemployed samurai from the Edo period took to the streets and formed gangs with other high-born youths. One street gang called the Kabukimono were known for being quite flamboyant, wearing strange clothes and using strange slang, and they would roam the streets harassing people and getting into fights with other gangs. The natural enemy of the Kabukimono was the rival gang called Kyokagu, and they were known as vigilantes made up of lower class people who protected the people. The clashes between Kyokagu and Kabukimono caused a lot of bloody gang violence in the Edo period, so even when there was no outside conflicts, there was still bloodshed.
Number 10, the Jaguar Warrior. Mesoamerica, a beautiful ancient place full of culture, wonder, and civilization. If you're a Spanish conquistador, then the most important thing there is riches, gold. There's lots of gold there. Tons and tons of riches. However, something some folks may not know about is a very powerful warrior the Aztecs had, the Jaguar Warrior. RAR XD. Don't ever do that again, sorry. that's just the worst. Yes, and just as vicious as it sounds, the Aztecs had no standing army, so most men were kind of just trained to be warriors just in case. The Jaguar Warrior was a fierce warrior who proved his salt by capturing 4 enemies. And only then he would be classified as such. Now, why is capturing enemies so important, you may ask? Well, it's so you have a plenitude of sacrifices to make when the gods ask you for some. Oh yes, they do this in full dress too, sometimes even wearing a jaguar skin on their head and their backs. It's kind of weird. Just keep your eyes out for those ones, folks. Keep your eyes out in the jungle, you never know. Number 9, Spartan. Did you really think I wasn't going to mention Spartans when talking about the most powerful warriors in history? Sparta, another beautiful ancient place full of culture and wonder. Sadly, these were times of great battles, and none were better than the Spartans at this. Complete with their Agog training, Spartans were bred for this kind of butter. Working as a unit with a group of Phalanx strategy made them extremely effective. Complete with their shield spear and short Zepho sword, the Spartans were a formidable fighting force, and the bravest of warriors. You only have to look at the examples like the Battle of Thermopylae to have this make sense, and the movie 300. I love those painted on abs, you gotta love them, right? Number 8, Samurai. Anime fans rejoice, because I have now mentioned samurai. All is well. Where would we be without the samurai and his katana? I don't know honestly, but they are warriors not to be trifled with, I do know that. The samurai were a unique class of warrior, and in the beginning, they were paid to protect the goods of those who could not afford such services. But eventually they became so wealthy that they became a noble class of their own, and their boss sort of became the leader of a fractured nation. The emperors are still there, but the shoguns, they're the ones in charge. Kinda like your mom and dad at home. Yeah, dad's there, he shows up, but Mom runs the show. We know how it goes. They followed a code of honor and did whatever to uphold that. Cunning warriors and excellent swordsmanship, as well as archers and horse riders. They were so cool that it gave George Lucas an idea back in the 1970s to base the Jedi around them. If that's not cool, I don't know what is. The samurai ruled for hundreds of years, with their share of victories and defeats. Number 7, Ninja. The warrior that goes bump in the night. The reason why dudes with my proportion thinks warriors in black cloaks running on rooftops with frog-toed shoes are cool. I know, nice. The ninja, stealth and espionage expert, and maybe the first to do so. The ninja were a group of mercenaries in the 15th century Japan, or at least got their start in 15th century Japan, who rose to prominence as the guys you hire when you need some shady stuff done. The battles between samurai and ninja are noteworthy to say the least. However, the fact that more often than not, instead of fighting the samurai often hired the ninjas to do their dirty work. Corruption, theft, sabotage, and just some good old-fashioned spying. Good old stuff. This sneaking around was accompanied by some excellent fighting tactics and dastardly weaponry to go along with it. The black egg in particular gives me nightmares. It's kind of like when you got something stuck in your eye and you just can't get it out, except it's not an eyelash. It's a little egg that you throw at people's faces and it's filled with crushed glass. Ouch. I don't even know how you'd get that out in ancient times. There's no eye wash station, so you know what? Cut it. I ain't part of that one. Ain't doing it. Nope. Number 6, Flama. Here's something new I learned. That's how you know it's going to be a good video, folks. I actually learned something, I know. Flamma was a Roman gladiator, perhaps of Syrian descent, or maybe Roman, we're not exactly sure. However, the story goes like this. The Roman Colosseum, big stands with big fans, maybe even some snacks too. It may be a blood sport, but you gotta have some grub. Personally, I'm a ballpark dog kind of guy. One shot of mustard, one shot of ketchup, please. Anyway, I digress. Flamma was a very interesting gladiator. Unlike most others, he took part in a lot of battles, probably the most. And like a lot of others, he was taken to become a fighter at such a young age, so he could earn his freedom. So he fights for his freedom, that's kind of crazy. The thing with Flamma is that he won 4 times. Won his freedom 4 times. And each time he refused and continued to fight. It's more of a, I'm not locked in here with you situation, you're locked in here with me situation. I'm good at Call of Duty sometimes. That's gonna count for something though, right? I'm not a gladiator, but I can play Call of Duty. That's good, right?
Speaking of cosmetics though, let's talk about Vikings' teeth for a moment. Having nice teeth, it's a sign of attractiveness, good health, but these ancient warriors would modify their teeth for reasons that aren't 100% confirmed, but we can speculate that it was to make them appear more fierce, because I don't think Vikings were all too concerned with pretty, other than their gorgeous blonde locks. Skeletal remains of ancient Norsemen had been dug up in Sweden and parts of Denmark with horizontal grooves kind of carved and cut into the front of their teeth. For the most part, they were just horizontal lines, but there have been other shapes found as well. Again, it's not 100% known why some of them did this, but it's said that maybe they dyed the grooves to create kind of cool lines on their teeth, almost like tattoos. It would have been extremely painful, as you can probably imagine. Nobody likes going to the dentist. And it wasn't super common, but it was definitely a bit of an ancient Swedish trend. There are plenty of cultures all around the world that would also do something similar to this, but Vikings are the only known culture in medieval Europe to have practiced it. Next on the list we have swords and weapons. There are several traditions held at Viking weddings that are rather familiar. The bride and groom would exchange rings, they would celebrate with a feast, there would be animal sacrifices, all pretty standard, but unsurprisingly, swords also played a major role in Viking weddings, because of course they did. First of all, the groom's buddies would hide a sword in the grave of one of their ancestors, which the groom would then have to find and retrieve, kind of like a sword scavenger hunt. Pretty fun. If I ever got married, I might want to incorporate that somehow. And then when it came to the actual wedding ceremony, the bride and groom would exchange rings. Yawn. But they would also exchange swords. These swords would have been passed down through their family, and the exchange of the blades symbolized the union of the two families that were now there to protect one another. It's actually quite a lovely idea, really. The Viking funeral. We've all seen this one in movies and shows before. It's that classic ritual where a warrior or king is sent out on his ship and burned at sea. There's a common misconception that this is pretty much how all Viking funerals took place, but this was really more reserved for higher ranking members of society, as ships were expensive and, you know, kind of important to people who would like raid villages and travel around the world. But the first step was to prepare the body of the deceased. It would be washed, dressed in its best clothes, and adorned with jewelry and other belongings. It was then placed on a wooden boat. The boat was filled with the deceased's possessions, weapons, food, sometimes even livestock, or even a sacrificed slave. Family members would often place personal items and offerings in the boat as well. Once everything was set though, the body was taken to the funeral site. The boat was then set ablaze either by a torch or a flaming arrow, and then the flames of course would consume the boat and the possessions of the deceased, releasing the soul of the departed to the afterlife. The Vikings believed the higher the flames, the better the chances of the deceased's successful journey into the afterlife. So family members would often add oil or other flammable liquids to the fire to ensure a bigger, brighter blaze. And why not? I mean, if I'm gonna go, I want to go out as as big a fire as possible. Go out with a blaze of glory. The Blood Eagle. All right, this one is pretty gruesome, so fair warning. It seems as though Vikings could get pretty creative with their methods of torture. The blood eagle was a nasty practice in which the unlucky recipient was restrained, lying face down on the ground. Then the image of an eagle with its wings spread out was carved into the victim's back. Already sounds awful, but nowhere near finished. Typically using an axe, each of the victim's ribs were then separated from their spine and kind of like splayed out. So in the end, they'd have almost this appearance of wings coming out of their back. Pretty creative, hence the name. Hold on though, still not done. Sometimes, if they were feeling extra feisty, they'd even rub salt into the wound at this point by literally rubbing salt into the open wound. And just to top it all off, the lungs were then pulled out and splayed over the exposed ribs, which would then kind of flutter in the wind like a bird's wings. Vikings would often perform this horrific ritual on their worst enemies or even members of their own society who had been deemed dishonorable. So yeah, living in the Viking Age would have been even more brutal than you may have thought. It's not 100% known, once again, if this ever actually happened or if it was more of a tall tale, but I don't know, I wouldn't be surprised it was really a thing. People can be pretty messed up even nowadays, so you can only imagine what people were up to back then. And coming in at first place is the practice of awaking one's berserker power. Berserkers are not just a thing of myth. These barbaric warriors were really said to have existed, and the method of becoming a berserker was pretty brutal. They would undergo a process of kind of death and rebirth, stripping themselves of their humanity to live in the wilderness as the animal they represented. There are kind of three types of berserkers that are kind of known to have existed. There are wolf kind of ones, bear ones, some kind of took on the appearance of a boar. They would hunt like animals, raid villages with a ruthless animalistic fury. For their battles, they would enter into this almost trance-like state after performing dances and howling and roaring at the sky. They often fought completely naked too, which would also be, imagine just an army of big naked men roaring like animals rushing in from the forest to raid your village. Berserkers just evoke such awesome imagery, and it's no wonder they're some of the most iconic warriors in history.